So throughout the afternoon, we're going to be using the Declaration of Independence as a lens to see the United States in the world and from the world, then and now. For some, the Declaration of Independence is a historical document. For others, it's a normative yardstick for the present. It's a living thing. It's a promise which can inspire and sometimes challenge Americans today, reconnecting us with the powerful ideals on which our nation was founded. Just as some look at the Declaration and see inspiration, others look at it and see invisibilization, a pledge of freedom for certain Americans made at the same time as that freedom was denied to others. And as we'll see this afternoon, the promise of the Declaration has animated and inspired people far beyond the United States, from the 18th century to the 21st. The Declaration has been woven into poetry and prose, just as it has woven the valorization of independence and, implicitly, the disparagement of dependence into the fabric of the United States for the past 2.5 centuries. All astonishing, really, when you think that it was drafted within just 17 days in the summer of 1776. Any academic would be jealous of that. So, 250 years on, the Declaration is still revered and is still contested. And above all, it continues to fascinate. It's brought us all here for today's event, which we think may be the largest or one of the largest gatherings to commemorate the US on its 250th outside of the US itself. So thank you for being here and for making it so. The conversations you will hear today are emblematic of what we're trying to build in Cambridge, where we're fortunate to have more scholars studying the United States than in any other university outside of the US. Our network has brought together more than 50 of these scholars to work on vital questions and challenges facing the US and the world. And today we're launching our effort to create a new Center for the United States of America at Cambridge, or CUSAC, as we're calling it. At the heart of this effort is our commitment to dialogue and problem solving across disciplines, across perspectives, across the academy, civil society, policy practitioners, and publics. And we know that what comes out of dialogue is greater than the sum of its parts. We believe in looking to the past to understand the present, but also that we have a duty to think about the future, whether in terms of scholarship, public understanding, or policy. We believe in comparison as a productive framework, and I was reminded of this just 2 days ago when I was on Ellis Island in New York Harbor. As you may know, 12 million immigrants to the US landed there between the mid-1800s and, the late 1800s and the mid-1900s. So 12 million Americans, and 40% of Americans today are descended from those immigrants. You cannot understand the US without understanding the world. We also believe in connection and the vital importance of bringing together Americans with colleagues and friends from across the globe to study the US now more than ever. We have a very exciting lineup of conversations ahead of us, and I hope you really enjoy the day. But now, first, I'm honored to welcome our Vice Chancellor, Professor Deborah Prentice, to the podium to say a few words. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to be here, I say in my telltale American accent. So Cambridge has a very long history of close links with America, older than the USA. In the 1600s, several Puritan colonists, including John Winthrop, founder of Massachusetts Bay Colony, and John Harvard, who bequeathed the funds to establish the first university in British North America, had been educated at Cambridge. 3 signatories of the Declaration of Independence were Cambridge alumni: Thomas Nelson of Christ College, Thomas Lynch Jr. of Gonville and Keys, and Arthur Middleton of Trinity Hall. Cambridge's Legacies of Enslavement report revealed them all to also be enslavers. And there's an interesting story here. It's partly because, in fact, the northern colonies at the time the Declaration of Independence was signed already had several universities where they could send their kids, while the southern colonies, where slavery was more extensive, did not. So for southern families, it was as easy to send their kids to Cambridge, UK, as it was to send them to Cambridge, Massachusetts. And so we tended to have more Southerners in those days. The pioneering free black abolitionist and educationalist Alexander Crummell Queens College, who was a New Yorker, became the university's first Black graduate in 1853. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Cambridge graduates can be found across virtually every field and walk of life in the United States. And so let me tell you a few famous ones. They include J. Robert Oppenheimer, Vladimir Nabokov, Sylvia Plath, Milton Friedman, Danielle Allen, Henry Louis Gates Jr., Rachel Weitz, Ron Chernow, Senator Richard Blumenthal, Joseph Stiglitz, Usha Vance, and Jeffrey Hinton. It's sort of a hard list to process. You have to sort of think about that. It's such a going from here to there. Needless to say, we have a really diverse group of American alumni, of whom we are extremely proud. Cambridge already has one of the largest communities of scholars working on American society, culture, and institutions anywhere outside the United States, as Ella said. And it's across more than a dozen of the university's departments and faculties. So you're going to have a chance to meet some of those colleagues today at this podium, but also I think there are probably quite a number in the audience. So today we're going to be hearing in particular from colleagues from the history faculty, the Department of Sociology, and the Faculty of English, but we have many others. We think there's a particular benefit to thinking about the United States from the outside in and bringing together thinkers from the United States, the UK, and the rest of the world to address the big questions about American society, culture, and institutions. This USA at 250 event is a little piece of what Cambridge does best, which is bringing our scholars into dialogue with fascinating thinkers to advance public understanding of important topics. So that's what we're all about. We will be hearing a range of wonderful voices from the wider academy, including the disciplines of art history and law, and also from the fields of poetry, politics, and journalism. They will help us explore the fascinating and vital role of the Declaration of Independence in American life, from the imperial crisis of 1776 to our challenging present. So now I'd like to invite the U.S. Ambassador to the Court of St. James, Ambassador Warren Stevens, who is here with us today, to say a few words. Thank you.
Vice Chancellor Prentice, thank you very much. Chancellor Lord Smith, very nice to meet you. And good afternoon to you all. And thank you for the warm welcome to Cambridge today. And I appreciate you all being here to commemorate America's 250th anniversary. And I'd like to start by congratulating the university on 25 years of Cambridge in America, and also the launch of your new Center for the United States today. We're honored that so many in the United Kingdom and beyond still take such an interest in studying America's past and present. And I hope we're giving you plenty to study. Our event today seeks to address the question of whether the Declaration of Independence is still relevant in 2026. And you really won't be surprised by my answer, and I'm not making any news here. But as we are meeting in Cambridge, a temple of enlightenment, thought, and debate for centuries, it is not enough for me to just tell you that the Declaration is still relevant, but I intend to prove it with facts and historical references. And I would like to begin with a brief look back in history to before 1776 and the birth of America. Because in the course of world history, most of the great nation states have been founded on the bonds of geography, cultural identity, or conquest. The ancient civilizations of Greece and Rome came from the fusing of local tribes and cities over time, sometimes through negotiation, and sometimes through subjugation. And while I won't attempt to summarize the United Kingdom's history to this room, it is sufficient to say that the UK was formed over millennia from the conquest and cohabitation of groups from the Celts to the Vikings to the Romans, Saxons, and Normans. What we should ascertain from that list is that in the course of world history, America has a unique origin story, because ours was a nation not built on geography, conquest, or cultural ties, but on ideas and beliefs, unglamorous as it may seem, on documents. Perhaps the most important of these documents is the Declaration of Independence, a letter written and signed 250 years ago to express the hopes and ideals of the newly proposed nation. The opening paragraph of the Declaration begins with the case for separating from Great Britain, but I'll skip over that for this audience. It continues with what decorated author Walter Isaacson has described is the title of his latest book, The Greatest Sentence Ever Written. Namely, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I'm inclined to agree with Isaacson's statement, because within that famous sentence is a revolutionary idea. The idea that all men are created equal and deserve a chance to live in freedom. Freedom to make our own choices, to practice our own faiths, and speak our own minds, and select our own leaders. And as Benjamin Franklin added, after spending extensive time with his friend, the Scottish philosopher David Hume, those truths are, quote, self-evident. Thomas Jefferson's original version said sacred and undeniable, but Franklin wanted to be clear that these freedoms speak for themselves. They should be universal, evident to all humans, self-evident. In the 250 years since those 56 courageous men put everything on the line to sign the Declaration, America has embarked upon a bold experiment to implement those founding ideals. This experiment continues today, and it is always evolving. Of course, the United States is still relatively young compared to the UK, and we're still learning from our own mistakes. Sir Winston Churchill is rumored to have said, "You can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else." But the transatlantic connection is important because the ideas contained in the Declaration of Independence, the liberty we have pursued in the United States since 1776, came not from American textbooks or libraries, but from the literature housed in temples of academic thought, like this one. Not just in the foundation laid by philosophers like David Hume and John Locke, whose work is so evident in the words of the Declaration of Independence, but also in the academic background of the signers. As the Vice Chancellor said, 3 of whom studied here at Cambridge. For this room, I will point out that only 1 of the signers went to Oxford. That heritage has given us, as President Trump so eloquently described it when hosting His Majesty the King in Washington, D.C., quote, the richest inheritance one nation has ever given to another. Or as Sir Winston Churchill said to an audience of students at Westminster College in Missouri 80 years ago, the same speech where he coined the term special relationship. Sir Winston said, "The great principles of freedom, Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, habeas corpus, and the English common law find their most famous expression in the American Declaration of Independence." Quite the tribute from the man who helped save Europe from tyranny in World War II, and who many historians would say was the greatest figure of the 20th century. The world needs those principles and that example of leadership more than ever. And our 2 countries, with their intellectual heritage and leading research institutions, are uniquely placed to provide it. From the free thought that can unearth more world-changing ideas like the rights of man and the laws of space travel, to the free markets that have enabled breakthrough innovations from artificial intelligence to cures for infectious diseases, to the free exchange between our countries that allows tens of thousands of students, millions of workers, and over $350 billion of trade to flow between the United States and the United Kingdom every year. Our countries really have led the world and continue to do so. Universities like this play a pivotal role in maintaining that edge by pioneering technologies in partnership with our leading businesses, by creating spaces for free thought and inquiry, and by facilitating exchange through programs like Fulbright and Marshall scholarships, which have enabled our people to learn from each other for decades, including this building's namesake, American innovator Ray Dolby, who was so influenced by his time at Cambridge that he made the generous donation which helped fund these outstanding facilities. And also the late Milton Friedman, whose work had such a monumental impact on economic theory and on my own career in finance over 40 years. Those examples remind us that the Declaration of Independence was never intended to be a static document gathering dust in a government archive. Its words may have been fixed in ink, but the ideas behind them remain the eternal foundation of the United States. As Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas stated, the Declaration of Independence did not establish a form of government. That was the work of the Constitution that followed. But it stated the purpose of government. That purpose was to protect our God-given, inalienable rights, rights that all individuals equally possess. I didn't know until reading Walter Isaacson's book that the original sentence says unalienable. Why Benjamin Franklin decided to change it, I guess, will always remain a mystery. But the Declaration was an invaluable resource for interpreting the Constitution and remains so today. Justice Thomas went on to say that the indispensable part of the Declaration comes at the end, when the signers, quote, pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. It was not a hollow pledge. 17 of the 56 signers had their homes burned, ransacked, or confiscated. Benjamin Franklin lost his relationship with his son, who remained loyal to the crown. Their example reminds us it's not enough just to have an idea. You have to act on it, to put it into practice, to be willing to make sacrifices for it. Because the words of the Declaration were powerful on paper, but they came alive in the sacred bonds between the men who lived them out, applied them, and even died for them. Those bonds continue in the American nation we know today, and they continue in the shared ideals that bring the United States and the United Kingdom together. Those individuals are, in my view, those ideals are, in my view, as relevant in Cambridge University in 2026 as they were in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1776, the place where the words, the United States of America, first appeared on paper. In letters from George Washington's military headquarters to his officers in the field. As I began by saying, America was unique in being founded on words and ideas, but it was the actions of the Declaration signers, the bonds between them, that caused those ideas to change the world. 250 years later, we are proud to continue their legacy in the United States and in the United Kingdom by taking up their work of interpreting and enacting the ideals that have underpinned our shared success for centuries. Thank you. And congratulations again on establishing the new Center for the Study of the United States.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Stevens. My name is Nick Guyot. I teach American history here. I just wanted to say thank you both to you and also to your staff for making this visit happen. It's been wonderful to have you with us. We're going to need a minute or two to rearrange the furniture, so please stay where you are for our first panel. I'd like to thank the Ambassador and the Vice Chancellor once again for being with us. Thank you very much. Okay, everyone. Hello, welcome back. So let me say again how great it is to see all of you. I know this is a nightmare time of the year to get involved in anything that doesn't involve taking an exam or marking an exam. So for everyone here in particular who's come from the university, we're extremely grateful. To those people who've come from further afield, and here I'm going to count our speakers, but also the various other friends, alumni, supporters of what we're trying to do here in Cambridge. Some have come a very, very long way to be with us. We're so grateful to you and so delighted to see you, and we hope you really enjoy your afternoon. We have a lavish program. I mean, I say lavish, I'm not sure I've ever felt a Cambridge program that's got that sort of textured feel on the top. It's so exciting. I hope you all have a copy. That program has within it bios for all of our speakers. So because we want to try and keep things running fairly smartly today, I'm going to be quite limited and just give you their names, but you can find out much more about them in the program. I will, to begin with, though, offer you a word of reassurance. This is not an academic event, by which we mean this is not a conference. That word is banned. Nobody is going to make a 5-minute presentation. Nobody is going to take you down their particular research rabbit hole. Instead, we're going to try and have a conversation. And we hope it's a conversation that all of you, whether you're historians, whether you do something else for a living, whether you're British or American or wherever you come from, can follow along with and feel engaged by. So everyone has taken a solemn oath to make sure that they don't go down those rabbit holes, and it's the job of me and our other two moderators to make sure that no one does. Having said all of that, I am absolutely delighted to be joined by Zara Anna Sandslin, who's from the University of Delaware, by Mia Bay, who is from the University of Cambridge, and also by Elijah Gould, who is from the University of New Hampshire, but who is also this year the visiting Harmsworth Professor at the University of Oxford. So Lige, Mia, Zara, we are so delighted to see you. What we want to do in this panel is give you some sense of why the Declaration of Independence mattered in 1776. So I'm going to start with a small question for Zara. Zara, what did British North America look like on the eve of the American Revolution?
Well, I'm going to start perhaps a little controversially and say that I think the term British North America, if not a complete misnomer, is a bit misleading. Because it was not entirely populated by people from Britain, Scots, Irish, English, nor was it an empire existing in a space that had never been populated by other empires. And in addition to British interests, of course, and people, you have people from various other European places, Germans, Dutch, Swedes, etc. Oh, the French, I should mention the French. They're very important in British North America. And of course, you also have many people of African descent, most of whom are enslaved, but some of whom are free on the eve of the Revolution. And of course, it's important to note that British North America is that what's on the map does not always equate to what's on the ground. And everything that unfolds in the time period we're about to discuss is unfolding on Indian territory. So British North America is peopled with indigenous people, and many of these indigenous people, all of these indigenous people claim sovereignty over their lands. And so to think about British North America, I think needs a qualifier to start, that we need to think of Britain as not the only game in town, so to speak. And I think one of the important things about British North America, about the British Empire, that ties these polyglot, diverse people together is that it is an empire of goods. And that becomes very important in the American Revolution because the initial protests have to do, in many cases, with manufactured and other goods, and it has to do with taxes on those goods, and it has to do with colonists coming up with what we now call boycotts. And those are all thinking about how to use goods that people use, such as clothing or paper, as ways to exert a political influence and to make a political statement. And the other thing I will say is that when we think about the eve of revolution, we're discussing the Declaration of Independence a lot, and those are 56 white men who signed this document. But to focus on them, I think, is to miss the bigger picture of the many women and the many people of color who were involved in this protest and then this fight. And so I'd just like to start off by sort of problematizing and adding some complexity to the concept of British North America.
Yeah, let me just ask you a quick follow-up. From the perspective of Britain, given this complexity of identity and of origin of peoples in North America, who did Britons think North Americans were? Did they think they were British? Did they think they were the same as them, inferior or equal? Or?
So I'm already giving historians a bad name because I'm again going to say it's complex, right? Which is what historians do. But I would say one of the things that has surprised me in my own research is the extent to which, for example, in Britain, even as late as 1773, you don't have a clear divide between a British concept of America and American protest in particular and American concepts. This is a civil war as well as a revolution, but it's not just a civil war in British North America. It's an ideological civil war within Britain itself. As late as 1773, the two men who were elected to be co-sheriffs of the City of London are not only both Americans, but they're widely known to be American patriots. And I think that says a lot. And so I think that's also something important to bring out, is that this is never an easy divide. It's not an easy divide within British North America. It's not an easy divide across the Atlantic. And I think that speaks to the complexity and the fact that this is a war in which people take many different sides.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel that this is probably the hardest question I'm going to ask anyone on this panel, but Lige, I'm going to ask you of you. It's a difficult question because we want to get to the Declaration, but just for the sake of people here who don't know this period of history very well, can you give us some sense of how this relationship between these colonies and Britain, which had lasted for more than a century in many cases, fell apart during that period from 1763 to 1775?
Yeah. Well, picking up on Zara's last point, she's absolutely right. The British think of the Americans as fellow subjects. And we now see it as a misguided attempt on the part of Parliament to tax the colonists, first in 1764 and 65, the so-called Sugar and Stamp Acts. And then there are other attempts that follow those. We see that as a misstep. But from the standpoint of the British public, Parliament was simply treating Americans the way British subjects already were. However, to your point, this is not how Americans see it. And the Stamp Act crisis in particular of 1765, in response to Parliament's attempt to impose a Stamp Act on the American colonies, all of them, and that includes the West Indies, Nova Scotia, as well as the 13 colonies that rebel, is widely rejected. There are violent protests, and we generally see that crisis as the beginning of the imperial crisis. So that's part of it. The interesting thing, and I encourage everyone to read the declaration that is in the program, if you read the grievances, no taxation without representation is smack dab in the middle. It's not the most important, nor is it the least important. Instead, what Americans really objected to, and what turns this into the Civil War that Zara mentioned, is the British crackdown on the American tax protests, stationing soldiers in cities. By 1773, Boston, a city of 15,000, is occupied by 2,000 redcoats. Do the math, and what is that? Sort of one soldier for, every 7 Bostonians. It's an incredible occupation, and the abuses, as Congress saw it, followed on that. And so the experience of the blunt end of the British government's attempt to enforce those taxes is really what drives Americans into rebellion. In fact, there are Americans that say, well, maybe we should help pay these taxes. They're to pay for soldiers that are in Indian country mainly, that are to protect us. And in fact, the taxes that Parliament imposes end up looking kind of a lot like taxes that Congress will impose once the United States becomes independent. Instead, I would say it's really the crackdown that drives this.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we've got a portrait here of a population which is diverse, which is varied. We have some understanding of the relationship between Britain and the United States, the understanding and the misunderstanding. Let's just plug one last thing into this, which is the African American population. So about 2.5 million people in the 13 colonies, about 500,000 of them are African American, and about 90% of those are enslaved. Mia, can you tell us a little bit about that population and its kind of role in this dispute? Did it see itself as American? Did it see itself as British? What are the kinds of views amongst people, free, black, and enslaved, on the eve of the revolution with regards to this building conflict?
Well, on the eve of revolution, blacks in America were both African-born and American-born, very diverse experiences and levels of acculturation. But what they did have in common is that they were either enslaved or in some ways affected by the institution of slavery. So they were above all an unfree people who were very interested in the rhetoric that was blooming around all these controversies. For instance, in the protests over the Stamp Act, when whites were chanting liberty in stamped paper, slaves began to chant liberty, so that there was a sort of feeling in the air and a new kind of rhetoric that enslaved people, as well as free blacks, wanted to pursue and maintain. They were also interested to see the society kind of coming apart at the seams, introducing new possibilities for freedom with the British, especially in the southern colonies. So for them, it was a time in which the society seemed to be considering freedom in a new way.
Yeah, and that phrase I used, African American, you pulled me up on that. That's actually not a very helpful phrase then for thinking about black identity at that moment.
Right.
One of the images which is flashing up behind us just before we get to 1776 comes from 1775, and it's a proclamation by the Royal Governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore. Can you tell us anything about that? I mean, what Dunmore's proclamation kind of did, what it meant? I mean, should we be thinking about it alongside the Declaration of Independence? It's up there in the slide deck, but...
Well, Lord Dunmore offered freedom to enslaved people who joined the British, and this was something that enslaved people were willing to consider. It spoke to pre-existing hopes that the war would somehow bring freedom, and it spoke to the possibility of a kind of freedom under the king. And what you would see is that enslaved people across the regions tended to join whichever side that they thought would most likely to bring liberty on their part. It would obviously also have tremendous impact on people who lived in Virginia. It would help turn Southerners towards the Patriot cause because of their fear over what was going to happen to their enslaved population should this go forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have an extremely interesting, engaging, dynamic, and complex picture building up just before we get to the Declaration. I had one last question just before we go there for Zara, and I'm doing my best not to keep plugging everyone's book. But Zara's most recent book is really fantastic. I think you might be able to buy it downstairs in our pop-up bookstore. And it's all about Americans in Britain around the time of the American Revolution and how they experienced the struggle for the revolution overseas. So I wanted to ask you, Zara, did the Brits kind of see this coming? I mean, 73, 74, 1775, are British people aware? And if they are, what do they think about what's going on in America?
Well, first of all, I owe you a drink for highlighting my book.
It's very good,
Thank
but
you.
my students are here. We read this book together.
But I think that Brits were very aware of what was happening. And part of this was because of the robust print culture in the British Empire on both sides of the Atlantic.
Right.
But News from America, and that was often how it was billed, is News from America, would duplicate news that was printed in Virginia and Boston and Philadelphia newspapers in London, and vice versa. Of course, I want everyone to picture the fact that there's a time lag, so it's hard for us to think of, I think, in the age of instant communication and next-day Amazon deliveries. But this was a time in which it took weeks for information to cross the Atlantic both ways. And so people were aware, but they weren't always aware in the minute. And so I think that's a really interesting thing to sit with, is that the news wasn't always immediate. But Britain's, newspapers have always been a business. Newspaper people are not going to print News from America if it's not profitable. And so there was an interest in News from America. And as I mentioned, you have American patriots being elected Sheriff of London. You have American patriots who are known to be spies, who are still operating things like popular wax museums. And, it's by no means ever a clear distinction once you get across the Atlantic. And I will say in 1775, especially after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, so many Britons sent petitions to the king on behalf of the Americans who they saw as their brethren who had been unjustly killed in some cases and fought against, that the king actually stopped receiving petitions. And I think that's very telling. So Britons are very aware. As with any conflict, some think the American activities are reprehensible, and others, though, perhaps surprisingly to the audience, are proponents of the American cause, so much that even some people who were born in Britain and have never left the British Isles still call themselves American patriots. And I find that fascinating, and I think that is, we can say, almost purely an ideological attachment. These people are not interested in settling west of the Ohio River, for example. They don't have the sort of economic interests that many American patriots have in the war unfolding. So many Britons who are pro-America are because exactly those stirring words in the opening paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, and I think another image in our slide deck above is of Common Sense by Thomas Paine, which is published in January of 1776. And Paine is basically fresh off the boat at that point. So this connection between the two is very important.
Yeah, and I think you'll also see one of the first copies of the Declaration of Independence that is printed, not without error, I will say, in a British publication, has an image of John Hancock at the top. And that is because people saw his signature and thought he was the main guy, which, as it turned out, he was not. But the way Britons thought about this was they said, John Hancock will be another Oliver Cromwell. Yep. And so they immediately are putting the English Civil War into conversation with the American War. And I think that's a very telling thing as well.
Absolutely. Well, the fighting, as you probably know, begins in April of 1775. But by the time we get to around now, the end of May, beginning of June, 250 years ago, the Congress is beginning to think about a Declaration of Independence. So let's talk about the Declaration for a few minutes. Lige, why a Declaration of Independence? Let's talk about that word declaration. What's the document trying to achieve, and what's its audience?
Yes. Well, a major part of that audience, it has several, are the powers of the earth that are referenced in the preamble. So it is a statement to opinion mainly in Europe and Britain, and they're certainly mindful. And actually, they do directly address their British brethren at the end. So it's a very outward-looking document, and it's doing several things. One, it is proclaiming the intention of the now former colonies to join the powers of the earth as free independent states. In that declaration, although it is a unilateral statement, is built in an appeal for those powers of the earth to recognize the United States as legitimate. And then the grievances, which I've already referenced, it's like a legal brief. Here's what the King of Great Britain has done to us. He's done things in his own right. He's stationed soldiers in our cities without our consent. He's allowed Parliament to tax us without our consent. So these are all targeting George III, even the actions that Parliament had done. And it concludes a king who is guilty of such things as a tyrant, unfit to be the ruler of a free people. And so it is designed to convince other powers, and they are addressing the British. In particular, though, they're addressing the French because they know they're going to need military help. As effective as Americans are, militia, they're going to need French naval power, French military technology, French resources, finances. All of this is going to come from overseas. So that is a big goal of the Declaration.
And this is always relational, then, you're saying?
Yes, it is. I would say, though, there's another role, and Paine is actually fascinating on this. We think of Paine as a radical, and he is, but there's always a kind of odd conservative counterpoint that some Paine scholars can have a hard time acknowledging. He says, until we, and he uses we, he's speaking as an American, even though he's just off the boat, as Zara says, until we declare ourselves to be independent, we are rebels in arms against our monarch. And Paine worries about that, partly in terms of persuading foreign governments, particularly France. He says they aren't going to help us, but it also is a very destabilizing situation to be in. And at the end of the day, certainly the signers of the Declaration, and these are white guys, wealthy, many of them enslavers, they do not want to prolong this moment of rebellion, which carries subversive implications for the structure of the social structure of which they themselves are beneficiaries. And so in that sense, there's a kind of conservative element to this as well.
I'd love to come back in the Q&A if anyone has questions about this role of the king. Because one of the big ironies of where we are right now is that at 250, the king sometimes seems the most liberal person in the room. Whereas, especially for Americans, whereas back then, of course, the king was the object of so much fury. And talking a little bit more, perhaps, about when the king becomes the object of that hatred might be helpful. But let's do it in the Q&A, because we should talk about Thomas Jefferson. We would be most remiss if we didn't speak about him. I actually want to give all of you a quick chance to chime in on this. Let me start with Mia. What do we need to know about Thomas Jefferson?
That is the hardest question.
I'll start simple and narrow. He's chosen to draft the Declaration of Independence because he's known to be a good writer and someone who has addressed many of the concerns that are going to be discussed in the Declaration in the past. He is writing, I think, something for posterity. He chooses to use very universalist language that makes one of the reasons the Declaration is as powerful it is today. But he is himself an enslaver whose own values do not seem entirely consonant with the values expressed in the Declaration.
Okay, let's come back to that. Lige, do you want to add something on Jefferson?
Yeah, I mean, what Mia said, I agree 100%. One of the things, and Jefferson is part of a committee of five, Franklin, Adams, Roger Sherman, and Robert Morris. And in everything Congress does, they try to achieve geographic balance. So it matters tremendously that Jefferson is from what will be the largest state, Virginia. And Virginia at this time includes not just modern Virginia, it includes West Virginia, it includes all of Kentucky. And in fact, Virginia's claims include land up into Canada. So it is the, it's the elephant in the room, if you will. And so it's very important that a Virginian take the lead in writing this document. So that doesn't, it's part of the complexity, but yeah.
Anything you want to add, Zara, or are you good?
Yeah, I would just add, I second what both of you said, that this is a group project, the Declaration of Independence, even though Jefferson gets much of the credit, which he, by the way, had a hand in after the fact. He was very invested in making sure that that became part of the mythos of the founding. But one of the things that was taken out in the group project was a lot of what Jefferson wanted to say about the African slave trade.
Yes.
Which in one of the most, bizarre mental gymnastics in the Declaration of Independence, he laid the blame at the feet of George III, and that was excised by committee. So I think it's important to recognize that, as Mia said, Jefferson is an enslaver, he's complex. He, to me, is something I always tell my students. The phrase, a man of his time, is, I think, one that needs some unpacking, because Jefferson was a man of his time. He was an enslaver. He also was very well aware that this was a moral issue for himself as well as for the nation, and yet he himself never did much about it. And I think that that's really important to pause and reflect on that. It's not as though there weren't abolitionists in the country, and even someone like Jefferson himself wanted to address the issue of slavery more forcefully in the Declaration, and the group committee took it out. And I think it's a great reminder that when we say a man of his time, we recognize that he was very well aware of the complexities and even not even the irony, the hypocrisy of, liberty or death in a country where many people were enslaved. So.
Yeah, I want to come back to this question of the relationship between enslavers and slavery and what's in the Declaration in just a minute. But let's do something in the first paragraph of the Declaration. And again, this is in your program, but you don't need to follow along. The first paragraph claims the right of Americans to assume, quote, the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. And I want to kind of cast you all back to a world 250 years ago, where the idea of claiming authority for a new nation is a real challenge. Leitch, can you give us a little guide to that world? Why was it so hard, challenging, daunting for these guys to justify this act of declaring independence?
Well, partly, I mean, we've long seen the Declaration as a kind of a symbolic regicide. They are removing the authority of the king. Again, they insist that we haven't taken this step lightly. We're not going to do it all the time, we promise. But it also, these are settlements that founded as colonies. They, unlike England, they had no pre-existing history as sovereign, independent jurisdictions. So, they haven't been conquered. Instead, they are offspring of the mother country, and oftentimes that family metaphor is used. And so to sever those ties, and when you think of how important the family is, particularly the patriarchal family, you don't get to leave your family. These are not choices you get to make. So they are doing a series of things that are very radical. And the laws of nature and nature's God, it's referring to international law, the law of nations. And they are saying what we are doing, in fact, is legal. It's legal according to the law of nations. And again, the grievances are there partly to show just what a moment of what an exceptional moment it is. It's a different kind of exceptionalism, but it's hugely important. And again, they're saying this is a unique moment, but in this moment, these laws entitle us to take the step that we are now taking.
Just in terms of a follow-up about, I don't want to be an American exceptionalist, obviously, but are there precedents for this? I mean, the Dutch leaving the Spanish Empire, or in a way, is it
Scotland? Yes. Okay. So there are precedents. The one that gets mentioned all the time is the Dutch War of Independence. That is the United Provinces, which is the formal name of the Netherlands, in 1776, had waged their own war of independence from Spain in the 16th century. It's a long, drawn-out war. And that is oftentimes mentioned as a precursor. There are also some important differences, and we could go very deep into the weeds and talk about those. But Nick has warned me I'm not allowed to do that. So
okay, but that's helpful. So we're not necessarily talking about an event that completely breaks all the rules of history up to that point, despite its significance.
There are precedents. Scotland is actually another, if we have any Braveheart fans here. The Scots had also waged their own war of independence against the English crown in the Middle Ages. Robert the Bruce, William Wallace, Americans are also aware of that. And again, there's some important differences. There are people in this room who can speak to them, but I think that's probably a little more technical than we want to get.
Zora's already mentioned the grievances against the king. And again, if you don't know the Declaration or you feel that you know it, you open up the program today, you're probably amazed to see that by far the longest part are all of these grievances listed and directed. So I want to ask Zora to tell us a bit about those grievances. And we sometimes think of the first bit, the preamble of the Declaration, as containing all this timeless wisdom. Is there anything timeless in the grievances? Are they still worth reading? Tell us a bit about them.
Well, I will say for Seinfeld fans, I say that this is the Festivus of founding documents, because it is like, air all your grievances, just get them out. I have a lot of bones to pick with you people, right? So there's that. And I do think that, Jefferson is a lawyer and he's building a case, as Lige said. And if you look at the image which is up there, which is the first printing of the Declaration of Independence, which is how most Americans first encountered it. So the parchment version, the sort of, Nick Cage National Treasures version, was created in August. So this is what Americans first saw. And I think that's important. And here the visual is super important because this is a printing that wastes a lot of paper. And the reason it wastes a lot of paper is that each grievance is set out as a single bullet point. And so for people who were meant to read this out loud, as Congress mandated it should be done, when it was received, it was a hint to the orator to stop and give a pause, and then to move on to the next grievance and stop and give a pause. So it's a note on performance as much as anything else. And I think that's been lost in our, visual understanding of the document as a parchment piece, because there it's just all paragraphs. Yeah. But this is how Jefferson and others intended Americans and the rest of the candid world to first encounter this. And this was the printing that was ordered from the official printer, John Dunlap, to the Continental Congress. And so I think that's really important because we sit with and love those first few paragraphs. But what Americans were first confronted with was overwhelmingly a list of grievances that build in this crescendo to a pretty outright racist statement that is meant to incite fear. This concept of, we have to seek liberty or it will be death. Yeah. And so I think that that's very important. And as Lige mentioned, taxation is buried in the middle. And I think it's only mentioned the once, right?
Right,
so that's, again, what we have sort of taken forward from the Declaration is not necessarily how people encountered it at the time. And we know that this fired people up because in New York City, for example, the reaction to the public hearing it read aloud was that they went and tore down a 4,000-pound lead gild-covered statue of George III that was standing on the Bowling Green. Now, that requires a lot of effort. So you've got to really be into that to pull down the 4,000-pound lead statue. And that was what this document incited. Yep. So I think we need to understand this as an oratorical performance, and this visual really emphasizes that.
Fantastic. So the Vice Chancellor mentioned the three Cambridge alums who signed the Declaration, so Thomas Nelson, Arthur Middleton, and Thomas Lynch. I was surprised that she mentioned they were enslavers, but I'm really happy that she did, and also gave you that explanation. But I think there's a bigger question here, and I want to throw this at Mia, which is how could enslavers sign up to a statement in this moment that said all men are created equal?
That is the question that everyone tries to figure out. But on the other hand, do they mean women as well? They are writing within a culture where you often mean specifically white men. Sometimes you mean property holders. They're, sort of all men of our class are created equal would be one interpretation of it. On the other hand, they, as Lige emphasized, they're writing for a public audience, and they're not going to get buy-in if they're like, well, so-and-so and so-and-so are created equal, So you have to kind of speak to the world. And in fact, if you look at this picture of who actually ends up fighting in the revolution, you're also not wanting to exclude any possible combatants that might be helpful. They did not go into the war looking for black soldiers in many cases, but they did enlist African and American-born blacks to fight in the revolution. They used Native Americans, so you just had to write a kind of inclusive script for the fight that's already underway when the Declaration is written.
Let me ask a slightly different question, but this may also be hard. Who sees in this moment a promise or a potential in all men are created equal, which is bigger than just white men? Does it take a little while before people kind of grasp that, or is it almost instantaneous?
It is surprisingly immediate. Yeah. Lemuel Haynes in Massachusetts, who has just finished the indentured servitude that he spent his growing up ages in. He's a mixed race man who is sort of farmed out because his mother feels like she cannot raise him. He joins the Minutemen to defend his region. He hears the Declaration of Independence. He writes his own tract on what he thinks the revolution should bring, and he believes it should bring an end to slavery. Liberty should be further extended. And there's many instances like that. James Fortin, who's a freeborn African-American, not very old, hears it read in the square in Philadelphia, and he also joins the patriot cause. Immediately, people see this as a kind of language and sort of new lingua franca, a new argument against slavery, and try to mobilize around it.
So from 1776. Lige.
Yeah, so I mean, that's absolutely right. One of the things, when I teach the Declaration, my students always note how ambiguous it is. I mean, the word, I mean, all men are created equal, that appears clear. It's not so much that's ambiguous, but these are words that you can interpret how you choose. And I think that's part of this geographical diversity. Even though slavery is ubiquitous, slavery takes different forms and means different things in different colonies. And in Massachusetts, it's already coming under a serious challenge. And so, you know, Jefferson may have meant one thing, and these Cambridge alums who are enslavers may have read that and said, oh, well, that doesn't apply to the people I'm enslaving. But other people read these words very differently. And at the end of the day, you know, it's almost a jump ball. You know, it's open for interpretation.
Yeah.
Yeah, and could I just add that to follow on your points of the immediacy and the sort of snowball effect, Pennsylvania in 1780 passes the first gradual emancipation law, and their opening paragraph literally says, we don't want to be hypocrites because we have a Declaration of Independence and we are fighting for liberty against tyranny, and we are painfully aware that to hold other people in bondage is completely at odds with these founding ideologies. So it is used to craft, you know, legislation that will back this up.
I have 3 quick questions, and I'm going to throw it open. So if you have your questions at the ready, we'll get to you in just a minute. We're going to have some mics there going around the room. Very quickly, one question I did not warn any of you about. I realize that this has become kind of this publishing season in particular. One of the things a lot of people have been writing about, including our much missed former colleague Sarah Pearsall, is the global American Revolution. Can you argue that the Declaration, as well as Lexington and Concord, and is the shot heard around the world? How quickly does this revolution have a kind of global footprint? I'm looking at you, Lige, because I think you might be skeptical. But
well, the shot heard round the world was fired at the North Bridge. It's so defined by Ralph Waldo Emerson in 1837. So some of this is looking back from a later period. But yes, I mean, it does travel. I mean, what was the world of the Revolution? It wouldn't necessarily have included everything that we would define today as the world, but it does fall on very fertile soil in much of Europe, elsewhere in the Americas. By the end of the war, there are Spanish-American patriots who are already looking at this and taking inspiration from it. This is Spain's great fear. It's one of the reasons why Spain, unlike France, refuses to form an alliance with the United States, even though it fights very effectively against Britain and kind of on the side. They're frenemies. But
they can see what's coming.
Yeah, so because these words are, in fact, resonating. They're reaching a receptive audience. Oftentimes people, educated people on the margins of power, including women, religious minorities. There are people in Indian country who are reading these words and using them for their own purposes. So, yeah.
Let me follow up that then with Tazara. What do Brits make of the Declaration? And how hard is it for us Brits to accept the colonies are gone?
Well, as I mentioned, there was a printing of the Declaration of Independence in August. So pretty much as soon as it hit the coast of England, it was printed. But the first known printing is interesting because it shows up in a London publication called The Crisis, which was a very short-lived publication, in part because it was pro-American. And so this was something that illustrates the fact that the Declaration of Independence does shift popular opinion in Britain. And you don't have the deluge of petitions, for example, in favor of America that you had after the Battle of Lexington and Concord. In part, that is because there is a Treason Act in invoked in 1777 in the first months of 1777, that for the first time in British history, which of course has many, many treason acts because of Scotland, among other things, for the first time in British history, revokes the right of habeas corpus for anyone who is agitating, who's found to be, enough of an American rebel that they could be accused of that crime. And this is something that outrages Britons. You have people as far apart as Edmund Burke and John Wilkes, for the political historians in the audience, who both say this is heinous and this offends the Magna Carta and this should not be happening. And so you have this bizarre situation where you still have people, again, who are ideologically attached to Britain, but they tend to be people more in London, and they tend to be more people who are clued into politics in general. But you don't see from larger Britain the same type of support. But what you do see, speaking of the global impact, is you see people in Ireland, for example, sitting up and saying, hey, here's an idea. And in fact, you do see some changes in Ireland, and eventually, you have the 1798 Irish Rebellion, which you could trace a direct line from. And so I think, again, it's a complicated question, but the Declaration does seem to solidify you are either a really diehard supporter of the American patriot cause at that point in Britain, or you are, not. So it's much less. The effect in Britain, I think, is to make it, I'll use a very intellectual term here, much more squishy than it had been. So yeah.
Well, I wondered about that. I mean, Lige, probably maybe as an exaggeration or an oversimplification to say Brits were sore losers. Could we maybe turn that around and say that Brits experienced their own kind of transformative political kind of moment here in losing the American
totally.
Revolution War?
I mean, historians of the British Empire and of the British Commonwealth oftentimes look back to the British response to the American Revolution as marking the beginning of this Commonwealth relationship where the crown will remain at the center of the empire, but at least the colonies of settlement will gain increasing sort of local governing rights. If you teach Canadian history, one of the great questions is, when did Canada become independent? You can write pages and pages on that. They don't have a July 4th moment because it's a gradual one. We haven't talked about the Loyalists, but they are an important part of this story. And in fact, a lot of that thinking around this Commonwealth idea is pioneered by the Loyalists, who are, on the receiving end. In many ways, they suffer the same grievances that the Declaration is accusing Britain of using against them. But yeah, so this is a transformational moment, and in a way, Britain experiences its own revolution.
I'm tempted to ask Mia when Canada became independent. You want to pass on that one? I've got one or two other things I'd really like to ask you, but I'm going to hold them back because what I'd love to do is open this up to the audience. We have a bit, like maybe 10 minutes or thereabouts for questions. So if anyone would like to ask anything of our panelists, please put your hand up. There's one there. And we have wonderful people wandering around with microphones. Thank you, thank you. Thank you. Let's start here. Should we start here? Let's start here.
So I apologize, it's quite a naive question, but I've been thinking recently, and this is based on a conversation at home, what the role of science was in the path to the Declaration of Independence. So, Franklin was so interesting. He was a scientist, an inventor, and a statesman, and he was one of the 5 people who wrote it. So what has kind of the historical record on the impact of the scientific thought of the time impacting how people came to the Declaration of Independence?
I'm going to ask one person to nominate themselves. Who would like to take that question on? Lige, Zara?
I could talk about it.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah. You looked like you didn't really want to dive into that. I think science is very important here because Jefferson also was a sort of, self-styled scientist. And one of the things that I think plays into this is what made Franklin famous in not just Britain, but Europe, was his electrical experiment. And one of the reasons that it caught the imagination of people was not just the experiment itself, but this sort of idea about what genius was in the 18th century, and the idea that someone from the bumbling colonies could do this brilliant experiment made him even more of a genius, because if an American can do it, then surely, It must be really hard to do indeed. And Jefferson, I think a lot of his motivation of thinking about America and its promise, which he elucidates very clearly in Notes on the State of Virginia, is the natural resources of America. And Franklin is similarly obsessed with the natural resources of America. And so I think that a lot of that natural history that plays into the scientific mind and thinking about America as this continent of untapped potential really does play a large role in the ability for colonial Americans to make the shift in imagination to conceive of themselves not just as leaving the British Empire, but founding their own American empire, which they easily envision as stretching from continent to continent, even though that's nowhere near geographic reality. And that's why you have the Continental Congress and the Continental Army. And I think science is in the background of all of that.
Thank you, thank you. Just over here. Hi.
Hi. You've described a group of very highly educated men writing the Declaration, and in fact, it's very lawyerly. The language is very educated. What was the, other than reading it out to people out loud, which is still not as accessible to a mass audience, what was like the TikTok of the time version, and how did they get the message out to a broader mass audience?
Well, Elijah's our TikTok expert.
Call them my kids. The Declaration travels in different forms. The first way it travels, and Zara's already referred to it, is the Dunlop broadside, which we've seen on the screen. And actually, July 4th isn't the day Congress votes for independence. It's the day they vote to publish it. It's when they hit send, if you will. So the Dunlop broadside is sent all over. It's sent to Europe, to Britain, to France, the Netherlands, and to the various colonies. And initially, it would have been read out loud. And historians of the book estimate that if you want to know how many people encountered any publication, you need to look at the print run, let's say it's 500, and multiply by 10. Because pamphlets, newspapers, they would be read in taverns and coffee houses. In Scotland, they read them after church. So even if you're not literate, oftentimes you're going to hear these. One of the great examples, going back to Mia's story, is Elizabeth Friedman, who launches the crucial freedom suit in Massachusetts that leads to the end of slavery. She allegedly does that after hearing a reading of the Declaration in the courthouse. I think it's in West Barrington. It's in Western Massachusetts. So that is, it's also, of course, reprinted, not always accurately, as Zara said, in newspapers and of course, broadsheets. One of the really interesting things about the Declaration, and looking at the Dunlop broadside, it will fit on a single sheet. So it can also be, nailed to a door or, public notice board. So there are different ways, but for a lot of people, they do hear it.
Thank you very much. Do we have time for another one? Does someone have the mic ready? Oh, over there. Sorry, sir.
I'd like to go back to the prelude to the Declaration a bit, because the earliest date you mentioned was, I think, 73, but what about the war that had just ended about a dozen years earlier? The cost of it,
yes,
the formation of the British North America, and the acknowledgement or the refusal of the American colonies to actually pay. Because many of the things that you list there as grievances and so on seem to be symptoms rather than coming from the fact that the war was very costly and the Brits were trying to pay for it.
The squirrel is not over. We're going to relitigate the American Revolution. I mean, that's true, though, on some level.
Oh, sure.
Would you disagree with this, Lige?
Yeah. No, I mean, there are a lot of people who would have agreed, and not just in Britain, but also in America, and the Loyalists. And we estimate that something like a fifth of the American population are either of some shade of loyalism, and probably would have agreed with that. I mean, it's important to remember the purpose of these taxes is not to pay for the war that had just been fought. They're not there to pay down the debt, which sometimes you hear. They're there to pay partly the cost of 10,000 soldiers that Britain left in the Americas, some are in the West Indies, at the end of the 7 Years' War, which you just mentioned. But they are paying for the cost of their own defense. Then there are huge arguments about that. Benjamin Franklin says these taxes are unnecessary because the Americans can in fact defend themselves. We don't need these soldiers. So some of the debate is about whether the soldiers are necessary. So again, we can get very deep into the weeds on this, but suffice it to say what you've just said is something that quite a lot of people agreed with.
Thank you very much. I think we've got time for one more. So just over there. Hello.
Thank you very much. I was just wondering, how did native populations respond to the declaration? Did they care? Were they aware? Did they think that it would affect them so deeply into the future?
That is the very first question for the next panel. But the next panel is different people. So actually, let's just ask. Does anyone want to jump in on that? Just give us a little preview. Anyone want to?
I mean, I'll say one thing, which is Lige brought up the importance of the family in this time period as both metaphorical and actual. And one of the responses of Indigenous people to this was to say, this is a family quarrel and we're not part of your family, essentially. Yes. So I think that that's a very important point to make. You want to add?
What you do see, I mean, I've been struck in the period after the war, is Indigenous nations who, it's like, we're going to have to deal with this new reality, declaring themselves to be free and independent, very much in the language of the Declaration, and but they're appropriating for their own purposes, and I think that should be considered part of the uses of the Declaration beyond the borders of the United States.
Yeah, and of course things shift from 1776 to 1780 to it's not a static.
Exactly. Yeah.
More to come on that question. When you do an event like this, you work with the very best university staff, and they absolutely ensure that you have to keep to time. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring up the next panel in just a moment. So there'll be maybe 2 or 3 minutes if you need to rush out to the bathroom or whatever. But this is the hardest we're going to work you today. So we're going to do these back-to-back sessions for an hour. At 3:30, you're going to have a vast period of time to visit the bookstore, to go off and have some tea and some coffee. But we're going to try and start in just a few minutes. So that will be for panel 2. Those are such great questions. It's been fantastic to have the wonderful panelists talking on this first panel. Join me, please, in thanking them. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that was, we got the segue. That was not planned, but perfect. Because this panel, my name is Jeremy Edelman, and I'm really delighted to have 4 distinguished guests here to continue the conversation. Our charge is to discuss the legacies of the Declaration of Interdependence. I mean, that's the segue to what's coming. The Declaration of Independence for the U.S. and the rest of the world. So it'll turn more to what happens afterwards and the legacies. We have Maggie Blackhawk, David Armitage, this is in order here, Martha Jones, and my colleague Emma McKinnon. I should say, since Nick began this role by introducing one imposter, which was Mia. I'm the second imposter, that is the Canadian on the stage. When the painting came up above the epic portrait of Montgomery dying on the fields of the Plains of Abraham in Quebec, it's a reminder that this was happening beyond the other side of what became the border between countries. And so it's a reminder that many countries emerged from this, and I think this is a theme perhaps to think about, including Indian country, other forms of societies to be discussed. So I have a script here, a wonderful script, which I'll use as a prompt list, and we should have plenty of time to continue the dialogue. So we figured our choreography would start at the extremes, at the edges, and work our way to the middle. And so, to the theme, what were the legacies for the United States and the world? And that conjunction is an interesting one. It's the U.S. in the world in relationship with other societies, maybe worth thinking about. So let's start with Maggie. We did not say that much, or I didn't hear that much, although some of the seeds were planted in the first conversation about what we can learn about the Declaration of Independence, interdependence, and the revolution from the perspectives of Native people, though it came up at the very end. That was our segue. And other marginalized groups at the same time, religious minorities came up. No doubt the drafters of the Declaration saw the limits on the promise that, quote, all men are created equal, with the underlining the equal. So how did those who were on the other side of the line, who were excluded from this vision, view this document? You talk about that inclusion and its limits in the Declaration.
Yes, no, I think the responses from the last panel really keyed us up to think about this question, and I'm going to build on some of the answers that they offered. I think with one initial important caveat and a slight corrective. When we talk about Native people, especially in North America, again, borders that are constructed later, the Native nations who were in what would become the state of Washington many, many, many years later cared little, if at all. And so when we're thinking about what Native people did in response to the Declaration, we need to think about the tribal governments and the tribal peoples who were within contact of British colonial North America, which was itself a settler colony clinging to the eastern seaboard. So the American experiment, even after the Revolution, was itself a bit of a moment, but it was really cabined to the eastern seaboard of North America and to around the 1763 proclamation line, which was a point of contestation. Part of what the Revolution was about was a fight between Britain and the colonists over whether or not they had earned the right of conquest to move over the 1763 proclamation line and, in a sense, take their largesse owed to them, they believed, under the law of nations after the 7 Years' War. So there was this point of contestation. The Crown drew the 1763 proclamation line, said do not go over, and Native peoples were themselves more comfortable with that than what the Revolution ended up with. And so when we think about how Native people and other marginalized people thought about the Declaration, I want to start by cabining my answer to that geography. Right. In large part because in many ways in the United States, we tell the moment of the Revolution, and especially the Constitution, as a country, as a nation from sea to shining sea that sprung whole cloth from that moment. And that is just an improper understanding of the long 19th century. So when it comes to people at the margins and how they saw the document, I study petitions, so I actually read the words, the arguments made by individuals, often Native peoples, Black Americans, throughout what becomes U.S. history. And we can learn so much about the Declaration from how it was used. The first panel started to touch on it as a legal document. We kept on referencing it has lawyerly language. Jefferson was a lawyer. And I think that they addressed it in the context of an outward-facing document. We are looking for recognition on the world stage from other nations. Interesting to reflect on the fact that the first nation to recognize the United States was actually the Wabanaki Confederacy in the Treaty of Waterton just a few months after the Declaration was itself declared. Mm-hmm. But we learn from petitioners using the Declaration almost immediately, 1777 and onward, like Prince Hall, who petitioned the Massachusetts General Court almost immediately for the abolition of human enslavement. And as we heard from Professor Bay, this was part of a broader intellectual and legal framework that was building up within African American communities within North America, and that was used much later by Absalom Jones petitioning in Philadelphia for regulation of the international slave trade. So this was a legal argument, and the Declaration formed part of that. For Native peoples, they took a different position. So rather than use the Declaration as an argument for inclusion, and to set the legal terms for what good government would be. So if you don't meet these terms, which you set for yourself, we will resist, we will rebel, potentially secede the same way that you did. Native people used the Declaration as precedent. Almost immediately, Simon Porridge of the Wampanoag Nation petitioned the Massachusetts General Court for independence of their own. It was not the first time Native people had petitioned for any kind of authoritative oversight, but they moved quickly from the Privy Council and the King to the Declaration as a legal binding document that, so the US was no longer bound by the King, but at least it would be bound by its own law, as it claimed. And
so what would they be separating from? Because if the Declaration, although we'll get to the Declaration of Interdependence, but for Native peoples, what would they be declaring against?
So it's interesting, if you actually look at the Declaration, we often think of it as secession, but you can see the legal distinctions between the right to self-determination, the right to independence, the claim of independence, based in sovereignty, equality, and not being conquered, versus a secessionary vision. So the right of resistance is secession and separation, whereas independence is really just an independent claim for self-government, which Native people had been using the British colonial system for proprietorship. Simon Porridge himself had petitioned the Privy Council successfully and been reimbursed by the British colonists for his trip. Native people moved between the ones who were in contact with the British colonists, moved in between the British, actually England, and the United States to be able to regulate that system. Of course, other European nation states are going to France, going to Spain. This is not an unusual thing. So the legal arguments are there, but you can see the way they shift under the Declaration, seeing it as a distinctive legal moment domestically amongst both Black American communities and Native nations who were in contact with the British colonists.
That's great. I think we'll cycle back to this question of what the multiple meanings of self-determination are as we think about these legacies. There is this other meaning, and I've been making this joke about independence versus interdependence. And the cue is over to you, David, because you've written this book about the history of the Declaration of Independence as a global statement. But you have a line in there which I use all the time. Lige alluded to how we teach these things, and when I teach global history, I borrow from I steal and borrow the line about it being a declaration of interdependence. And so one of your points there is it's a declaration made to the concept of quote unquote mankind. Can you say more about this? What is mankind for the authors, and how does it go out into the world and create a career for this concept, a political career for this concept of mankind?
So what we might call the generation of 1776, those who are old enough and active enough to engage with contemporary politics and the world around them in 1776, is probably the first generation in world history which has a vision of the entire globe. Think of the small pocket globes which are being produced in large numbers in the middle of the 18th century. Think of the burgeoning histories, geographies, even what we might call ethnographies, which are available both in book form and then in the daily press and in the monthly journals, which are available to literate people, and as we've just heard, also to those who would read them out, to those who are not literate. So this is a generation which has a global vision. That vision is packed into the Declaration in some of its key words. In the very opening paragraph, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind demands that we justify the reasons for our separation from Great Britain. So they're thinking about mankind at a moment when another relative novelty is coming onto the political stage, the idea of public opinion, both domestically and also internationally as well. And international public opinion can be shaped by declarations. There are two meanings of declaration at this moment, both legal. One is, as Professor Gould said earlier, a declaration is actually the technical term for the list of charges read out against a defendant in a common law court. But a declaration is also an outward-facing document issued by a sovereign to communicate to other sovereigns. Think of a declaration of war. That's shaping the opinions of mankind.
Right.
And then the grievances in the middle are the facts.
Right.
Again, a legal term, which are laid out for the, quotes, candid world. Candid, in 18th century parlance, means the unprejudiced world, those whose opinions may be swayed by logic, by fact, by history, then to come over to support the cause. And so the document is addressed to international public opinion at the moment when that international public opinion is very much seeing interventions like this, declarations like this, as documents addressed to them and of transnational and indeed even potentially global significance.
So this, let's call it the imaginary landscape of the world that is being invented at this time, not entirely out of whole cloth. I don't know if, is David's book available for sale downstairs too? Well, it should. Just say yes. Okay. You can get into more detail on that, but it does make an assumption about that world out there. Can you tell us whether that world, call it mankind, when it sits up and takes notice of this very peculiar document with all these internal logics to it, how do they receive this quote-unquote declaration?
Well, let's break that into two parts. How is the world imagined? It's a world of peoples who are organized into states, the powers of the earth.
The powers of the earth.
So peoples, we'll talk more about the idea of self-determination. Peoples organize themselves into states, among other states, which are in communication with each other. What kind of communication are they engaged in? They're engaged in making treaties, war, peace, and commerce. That's the interdependence, which is instinct in the idea of independence, is being a people among peoples within a state or states. United States is plural in this document, let us not forget, and remains plural really until after the Civil War, rather than a singular. If we're talking about a nation-state being fused and formed, that's a century-long process in American history, as most American historians would say. It's a state or a set of states first, which then becomes a nation, rather than a nation dying to become a single state at that point.
But is this document portable? I mean, how easily does it move? I think there's a thought, well, once it's announced, it's a declaration, the light switch goes on, and out it goes. How does it move?
So you find copies of the Declaration of Independence. There are 5 in the National Archives at Kew, the largest collection of the first printings of the Declaration anywhere outside the United States. They come out folded up about that size, or actually smaller, that you can put inside a letter. They travel with letters. One of the copies in the National Archives was actually sent by a Jewish merchant in St. Eustatius, the Dutch island and entrepot of Eustatius. On the letter that accompanies the declaration is written in Yiddish, in Hebrew script, and was assumed by the British captor of that letter and its associated correspondence, therefore to be dangerous code because he could not read it. But that's also a sign that this is being picked up by everybody. It's being picked up by merchants, it's being picked up by naval and military officers. There is a hunger back in Britain, but also among the British forces in the colonies themselves to find out what the heck is this document about. So we calculate maybe 200 copies were printed in that all-nighter by John Dunlap and his print shop in Philadelphia over the night of 4th, 5th July. But those copies move very quickly up and down the East Coast. They're reprinted and they move very rapidly in 18th century terms across the Atlantic. Within 6 weeks, news of the declaration has reached the German lands. Within 2 months, it's been translated into most major European languages and included either in full or in excerpts in newspapers across the continent.
I mean, I haven't been watching these screens, but there are, I'm told, to look out for the visuals of other prompts for declarations of independence from Haiti, the Latin American revolutions. So as a historian of Latin America, what one picks up is that the Declaration merges with other kinds of documents. By the time you get to the 1810s and 20s, when other declarations of independence are happening, there's a repertoire of declarations and ideas of sovereignty in circulation, in part set off by 1776. Just to shift gears slightly, in that first conversation that we had, Mia touched on how some of the early reformers looked to expand, back to this question of inclusion and its limits, to expand the meaning of declaration to make it more inclusive than the one that Jefferson wanted it to be, had in mind, especially in terms of the rights of Black people to claim belonging and citizenship in this new plural, the United States as a multiplicity, not so much in the single. Over to you, Martha. Can you tell us more about how Black and white reformers invoked the Declaration in the course of the 19th century? So moving forward in time in the way that the Declaration works its way through Latin American discussions about sovereignty. How would Black peoples of the United States incorporate the language of the Declaration?
So I think building in part off of, this very sort of dramatic picture that you've drawn for us of the way in which this text moves, not only in the United States, but across the globe, to think about the text from the perspective of Black Americans is to remember that it's nothing more than a text.
Right.
It is nothing more than words on a page. And that in order to imbue those words, to imbue that text with meaning, Black Americans have to move, they have to act, they have to pick it up, they have to insist. Yeah. So here we are with, in the United States itself, a question, a problem, a dilemma, a contradiction, I think someone referred to it as, which is slavery and freedom together. And we heard, I think it was Elijah who invoked Elizabeth Freeman, who by 1780 in Sheffield, Massachusetts, is going to pick up the Massachusetts state constitution, another text that includes that language we've invoked already so many times, all men are created equal. And Elizabeth Freeman is going to visit a lawyer and say, well, isn't it the case then that I am among the all men, and that indeed will be part of the undoing of slavery in the new Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Right? But that requires more than words on the page. In my view, it requires a great deal of courage and an extraordinary risk on Freeman's part to confront not only the man who claims her as property, but of course to confront the assumptions that run underneath the text, which is that in fact those words don't mean what they literally say. Right. And I think Freeman's story is often invoked to, in some sense, further the view that there were seeds in the Declaration that are going to germinate and blossom over time. But I want to also caution us about that. And take us to France, if I could, for a moment, to Paris in the very same moment, when indeed not only has this text migrated, but men who are signatories and charged with shepherding and stewarding the text are in Paris to sign a treaty that will end the American Revolution. One of them, John Jay, has in his household an enslaved woman named Abigail, who has come with the Jays from New York to Europe. Abigail will, in short, manifest her own view of the problem of slavery and freedom. I don't think anybody has necessarily shared with Abigail the text of the Declaration, which is a testament. Enslaved people don't need the Declaration, right, to recognize the profound contradictions. Right. But in Abigail's story, she will indeed attempt to secure her freedom, languish in a jail, in part at Benjamin Franklin's urging. This sort of punishment is intended to render her pliable, right, to returning to the Jays' home and remaining a slave. And she will die in the 1780s in Paris. And I raise that counter story for us as a reminder that there are too many Americans who do not live to reap the bounty of the Declaration, for whom those seeds may indeed have been set in the ground, but for whom the promise, the possibility, the resolution of that contradiction never is part of their lived experience.
I mean, so true, and yet there's a face looking out at all of us, or back at us on the screens, for whom it does have a meaning. So to get you to riff on Frederick Douglass, in a sense coupling the Declaration with the Constitution, to think about a more emancipatory possibility built into this. Could you talk a little bit, push it forward to think about abolitionism and the language of equality deeper into the 19th century, perhaps even anticipating the Civil War? What equality would mean for a figure like Jefferson in contrast, Lincoln in contrast to Jefferson's concept?
Sure, and I think we're all looking at Frederick Douglass, and remembering Douglass as one of the defining interpreters of not only the Declaration, but the American experiment writ large in the 19th century. Douglass has, by the 1850s, been part of what we term today to have been the colored convention movement. Public gatherings locally, statewide, nationally, by largely free Black Americans who have been chewing for a long time on the meaning and pushing the meaning of the Declaration in the interest not only of slavery's abolition, but in the interest of their own citizenship. And so Douglass, on the one hand, is among those Black Americans who are going to press the view that we should take the terms of the Declaration literally and hold the nation up to those literal terms, at least with respect to Black Americans. I wish they extended that analysis always to Native Americans, but they don't. But at the same time, by 1852, and I think this will be familiar to some folks, Douglass delivers his famous "What to the Slave is the 4th of July" speech. And now he's holding up the Declaration to mock the nation, right? Not to honor the nation or to help the nation live up to its potential in that earnest way, but to mock the nation, to expose the nation for its failures. So I think that for me, this is the legacy of the Declaration, is that it becomes a piece of political rhetoric that in some moments is the measure, and in other moments is the measure, but not always with the same meaning. And it remains, I think, until today, that sort of instrument, something that we use instrumentally, sometimes because we want to laud how we've fulfilled its best ideals, and in other moments, or perhaps in the same moment, how we've failed to live up to them.
I just want to cycle back, before we get to the 20th century, Emma, just to come back, because once we're there, boy, things are really going to start exploding. Just to come back to Maggie, so we've talked about inclusion, diffusion, and back to inclusion and how Native peoples respond to this evolution through the 19th century to think about their own conceptions of membership or sovereignty. I mean, I have in mind thinking of Cherokee in particular, but there are many others. Could you talk about how Native peoples interpret then the spreading or the repurposing of ideas of equality for their own agendas, especially faced with westward expansion?
Well, I think the two different ways of seeing the Declaration as a document to be used in North America are important. So one is an argument for inclusion, citizenship, and then being treated on equal terms within the constitutional status of that nation state that you're fighting for inclusion into. Then there's what Native people tried to do. And under the Law of Nations, which was really the international law-ish, but also domestic-ish law of the period, you could argue that you can see more of the Law of Nations in the document. So unlike the implicit exclusion of Black Americans and potentially women, there was explicit exclusion of Native people. The 27th grievance has in it a racial slur, merciless Indian savages, whose only known warfare is the unbridled destruction of all ages, sexes, and I'm not getting this exactly right, but conditions, thank you. And so what you had there was actually a legal argument. It sounds moral, it sounds racially inflected, which is all true, but it was also a legal argument that Native people could not claim nation or state status under the Law of Nations because they were savages. They would be excluded from man. And so part of what Native people tried to do was to argue for non-savagery or civilization to be included in the nations that would be recognized among these great states. And the Declaration was that moment of positive law, but where they could try and claim it and argue it for themselves. But it's important to see, I think, to not presume the nation state again. So that little experiment clinging to the eastern seaboard wanted to colonize over the 1763 proclamation line. The king did not want them to do this. They wanted to do this, and so the moment you had the Treaty of Paris signed, it was, and even before, there was a flood into all the way over to the Mississippi eventually. And then with the Louisiana Purchase further, Mexican-American War, you have Texas, you have all of these acquisitions. And throughout, you have people who do not want to be part of a border that's been moved over them, that do not want to be part of a constitutional order that was established as under a separate nation state long before with an amendment process that would almost never be met. And so the fight there was for exclusion, but recognition as an independent state. And so citizenship, equality, the question is always equality in what? We read the Declaration almost as a declaration, and they tried to have universal principles, but we have often understood that universal principles are a way of colonizing and disrupting and preempting other forms of being, other forms, the plural visions of government and the good. And so we need to sort of walk and chew gum at the same time to value the Declaration as a domestic limiting document for the constitutional nation-state republic that wrought it, and then also see it as a document where many people saw it as, we too, like you, are men. We too, like you, have this ability to claim independence. We have never been conquered. And to see Native people, you have John Ross, of course, petitioning. You have declarations of independence by the Mashpee Wampanoag in 1830. John Ross petition against the Trail of Tears, even petitions into the 20th century, just to get us to Emma's point. Sitka Saab petitions the Senate in 1924, which is the beginning of the legal framework that we have today in the United States, the Indian Reorganization Act, which has set up, or at least preserved, the government-to-government relationship, where we have over 570 independently governing, many of them with constitutions, native nations in the US that govern land masses that are larger than several states. And so that is a truism as well, and it's something that's lost in seeing the Declaration as one where everyone wants to be under it and everyone wants the equality that it promised.
Right. So we get the polyvalence, and you set up Emma beautifully here. So for the 20th century conversation, because you've written, about the legacies for the present in a way, and given us a vantage point for thinking about decolonization, which is now a word we're going to smuggle into the conversation, and the language of human rights, which is another vocabulary to bring in, and the role of rights language in general, all the way to the U.S. civil rights struggle. So can you talk to us about let's say, from picking up from Maggie over into the mid-20th century, how that works?
Yeah. So the sense of hypocrisy and the question of a sort of promise not yet fulfilled in the Declaration has come up on both panels for a while. And I think that, but also the notion of this as a document that's about freedom and equality and equal rights, and yet also about sovereignty and rightful resistance at the same time. And those continue as part of the 20th century story, but also come into tension in certain ways as well. So you see appeals to the Declaration of Independence, citations of its language, repetition of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, especially in debates over decolonization, in debates over equal rights and racial justice within the country as well in the 20th century. So some of that includes sort of use of the Declaration as part of a process of international petitioning and appealing to a wider world. But that question of whether this is properly part of an international appeal or a domestic matter that is about the sort of gradual fulfillment of an American promise and bringing the country in line with its own Americanness and stated ideals is I think, one of the animating tensions of the mid-20th century debates. So you see in 1947, Du Bois edits the NAACP's petition to the United Nations over the rights of African Americans, called An Appeal to the World. And that petition begins by talking about the Declaration of Independence and the country founded on these ideals, and then explains the suppression of democratic equality and the inability to fight for equal rights within the United States in arguing for the UN to intervene. So you see in 64, Malcolm X appealing to the Organization of African Unity, asking them to support him in appealing to the World Court to do something about the denial of human rights for African Americans. Both of those efforts fall short, and they get suppressed effectively, in part because of a concern about Cold War politics and the sort of the need for the viability of an international criticism of the United States. So I think part of what you see, both of these sort of stronger attempts to appeal to the Declaration and to use its spirit that was about a sort of appeal to the peoples of the world, that international spirit that David was talking about as well, in the 20th century, and also at the same time, the formation of a discourse around an American creed, this is a sort of set of foundational American ideals, and a promise that will be gradually fulfilled within the confines of the country itself. So you also see, as part of the founding of the UN, is a big moment for this, the writing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which Eleanor Roosevelt also presents as carrying forward the spirit of the American founding now for the world, and a sort of American promise for a peaceful 20th century after World War II. And an effort within what the civil rights movement to present demands in terms of inclusion and civil rights and making good on a foundational promise of equality, rather than an international appeal within that.
Okay, and maybe to get you and David into an argument. So it's impossible. We don't always have to agree on things. We actually seldom do in practice, so let's exhibit our disagreements. Is there a tension between, sort of, as it were, the rights of people versus the rights of states? Because one of the rhetorics of decolonization is the right of self-determination to separate a state from an empire, which would be one reading of the Declaration, versus the universal rights of peoples. And we know that by the time the UN approves the Universal Declaration, there's a dispute about what that means. Is that inscribed already in the Declaration of Independence? My sense from this panel is that is one of there's the inclusion-exclusion dichotomy, and then there's this other. Who has the rights? Is it the state or the people? I'm hearing you say that is a tension by the middle of the 20th century.
I'm not quite sure what having the state having the rights would mean, but maybe that's.
Well, David, then is this distinction between whether the political community speaks as one, or whether it's the right of an individual, that the people is the carrier of the rights rather than the state?
Well, if we see the long history of the Declaration in world perspective over 200, 250 years, we realize the Declaration becomes modular. It can be broken into parts, recombined in different contexts and for different purposes. And one of the fault lines is precisely that fault line, let's say, between the opening and closing paragraphs and the second paragraph. That most other declarations of independence in world history which make reference to the US Declaration refer to the opening and closing paragraphs. Powers of the earth, opinions of mankind, free and independent states, the things that free and independent states may of right do. Very rarely do they appeal to the second paragraph. The Venezuelan Declaration is an outlier there, but a really significant example which shows exactly the tension you're pointing to and that Emma had put out on the table for us is the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence, which I'm sure is coming up soon, from 1945, where Ho Chi Minh begins the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence with the lines, "All men are created equal," and then quotes the resounding opening sentences of that second paragraph before then immediately saying, what this now means is all peoples are created equal. All peoples have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So scaling up the individualist
So it becomes a more collective bearer of rights rather than individuals.
Exactly. So trying to square the circle by saying, actually, we can make those two sets of rights claims on behalf of peoples organized into states on the one hand, and then the individual rights, trying to square them and say they're actually the same thing, but by kicking it up to the level of the state rather than bringing it down to the level of individuals. That, of course, doesn't work. It all breaks apart. The modularity continues, and there's very little melding of those two sets of rights claims, which are held in uneasy suspension in 1776, but begin to fly apart relatively quickly afterwards.
So you see it flying apart relatively quickly. If we pushed it forward into the 20th century to come to Emma's work on human rights, is it a problem for thinking about human rights in the middle of the 20th century? Say on the eve of the great decolonization movement to come after 1945, is that there on the ground? I'm looking at you, Emma. You're still puzzled at what David just said.
No, I'm puzzled. I mean, it's a puzzling question because it's a part of the challenge is sort of who is supposed to be providing the rights, and if those rights are denied, then what is the remedy? And that is a problem that the Declaration itself is trying to work out and posing some possible answers to, and it's a question that keeps getting asked across the 20th century too. If these rights have not been guaranteed, is there a source of international appeal? Is separatism the answer? Is the need for a new nation the way to deal with this, or is it possible to achieve justice within the country? And part of the rhetorical power of the Declaration is the ability to pose that question and to pose it forcefully with the real question of whether whether justice is possible, whether the nation can cohere. And part of the tension then with human rights as well is that it starts to sort of universalize that question of the guarantor as well. So there becomes a related set of questions about if rights are not fulfilled, is there an international community that needs to step in?
On that point, and before getting to Martha and to talk about what kinds of rights, and specifically rights to vote and elections, because this is a hot topic, what difference does the existence, because if 1776, there are the great powers of the earth, by the time Emma McKinnon appears on the scene, there's a thing called the United Nations out there. Yeah. This is also a crucible year for the United Nations, it's worth saying, because the Secretary General's up for grabs at a crucial time. How important is the existence of this forum called the UN, in your view, for thinking about the reverberations of the Declaration of Independence for human rights activism?
I think it's for human rights activism in the present.
Century,
yeah, no, it's. I mean, I think that there's a big question of whether how much the UN can continue to be a relevant forum for this, and of whether. But it's part of a question of whether human rights as a 20th century concept can be realized. I mean, whether separating the idea of rights from the idea of the nation was actually tenable in the first place. Right. And part of what we see in the UDHR initially is an emphasis on the nation and the right to citizenship and participation in a nation as a fundamental human right, because that's supposed to be part of how rights are guaranteed. Right. And I think across the 20th century that starts to be decoupled a bit, and the politics of the welfare state are part of that. But the question of whether abstracting human rights out from a state that's there in part to guarantee them, and is also often the biggest threat to them, right. Is a viable prospect or makes those rights potentially less meaningful.
Well, we know, so suffrage is key to all of this. So coming to, as Emma said, to the internal logic of all of this, to ask you, Martha, to talk about the Declaration and the struggle for Black women's suffrage in particular. And David, actually, also going to bring you back in about the specific influence of the Declaration on 20th century decolonization struggles and the power of written declarations of independence in enunciating this. So let's first talk about suffrage inside states, and then Declaration of Independence for decolonization to get out of oppressive imperial contexts. How important is the Declaration for these?
So, I mean, the word that comes to mind for me is usurpation. I think that by the 20th century, the late 19th century, the Declaration has really been displaced by the Constitution with respect to certainly questions of political rights. Mm-hmm. And so, while it remains, I think, rhetorically powerful, beautiful, evocative, that the struggle for voting rights for Black Americans beginning in the early 19th century, but certainly by the time we get to the post-Civil War era, is one firmly grounded in the Constitution, the preference for the Constitution. So I think that's part of this story, is about the relationship between those two documents. Right. On the one hand, and on the other hand, and I'd be interested in what Emma thinks, I've been thinking, as I've been listening, I've been thinking about Marcus Garvey and the rise of Pan-Africanism, right? And this profound redrawing of the political landscape, a rejection of the nation state by Black Americans, and at least the beginnings, right, in the effort to reconstruct a political community that certainly does not touch back to the Declaration, but in fact acknowledges the incapacity, the unwillingness, perhaps, of the nation, right, to honor, to uphold, to live pursuant to the principles that are enunciated at the founding by way of the Declaration. And so I think in my telling of the story, whether it's a story of voting rights or a story of citizenship. Part of what I'm interested in our conversations today are really the ways in which, is my sense of the ways in which the Declaration falls out and becomes ritualized more than invoked as a source of force.
Yeah. So, David, the Declaration and international order, or the construction of a world of nations rather than a world of empires. How important is this document?
Not a world of nations, but a world of states. So more than half of the members of the organization we call the United Nations have a document which they call a Declaration of Independence, an Acte d'Indépendance, an Acte d'Independencia. But of course that reveals the fact that the United Nations is a club of states and should actually be called the United States. But
of the world.
Somebody had taken that name already. So there are thousands of nations, but only 193 states.
All started at Cambridge.
At the moment. But it becomes very important on the model of 1776, but I think particularly on the model first of the Haitian Declaration, but particularly, this is currying favor with our chair, the flood of declarations of independence, or Actas de Independencia, and similar documents after the implosion of the Iberian empires, particularly Spanish America, really sets the template for the promulgation, the publication of a formal document in the name of the new sovereign or sovereigns to the rest of the world, which then becomes the model ever after, all the way up to, let's say, Kosovo in 2008, the failed Catalonian Declaration of Independence of 2015, and the Declaration of Independence of South Sudan of 2011, which is the most recent successful Declaration of Independence, accompanying, of course, the entry of South Sudan into the United Nations as the most recent entrance there. It's not TikTok, but I think the South Sudan Declaration is the first Declaration of Independence one can view on YouTube. We're waiting for the first TikTok Declaration of Independence. Maybe live.
We're back to media, and communications. I want to ask Martha at the end to reflect on, let's say, the valences of this freedom narrative. And I mean, one of the takeaways here is this is an unfinished story in some senses. But to ask David, in light is the Declaration of Independence of states, not nations, ultimately a constraint for a global world? That we're now having to grapple with global challenges, climate change, peace, and so on, by hitching from 1776 the idea of freedom of states to defend our rights, limiting our ability to step up to global challenges. So I'm trying to get at the limitations of the Declaration as well as its promises, or maybe having endowed too much power to it to scale back some of the expectations for it as the emancipatory agenda.
So just a quick corrective. So I think in a certain respect, the Declaration is an index. It's a reminder of a body of law that we once had that restrained states in a way that was meaningful, and especially in the United States. Whereas today, we don't see any other higher authority than the U.S. Constitution, and we often won't look even to international law as a domestic matter. So we see no higher authority, and that authority is itself impossible to amend. And so I think we're giving the Declaration itself as a precedent within a body of law that has always been moving, in which Native peoples, in which Africans, in which Black Americans, in which women, in which children all participated in, particularly through the petition process. But this was a making of positive law that, especially in the late 18th century, was that moment of, we are going to pull that down, the laws of nature and of nature's God, into our hands and proclaim them as a positive sense. And so that was a moment of opening and a precedent, but I I think it's a problem of American exceptionalism to think it's the Declaration, now that we have all the law of nations and natural law in the Declaration versus bodies of law that the Declaration is just drawing from. And so there are ways in which we can move away from the Declaration. I don't know if I'm skipping ahead too much, but today in the United States, at least for constitutional lawyers, the Declaration is known as the Hail Mary of constitutional law. It's what you go to when you have nothing else, to use a sports metaphor that I know nothing about, but it's something you throw when you have nothing else to throw, when you don't have any law. When in reality, we have long needed to tussle with, especially in the United States, ways to restrain the state that are looking to broader principles than simply the Constitution. Because the Declaration was seen as that. We've just lost that entire level of legal restraint over time, one in which would keep the United States from, not that it did a very good job of it, but of conquering other people and of colonizing other people and of turning into an empire, but also of restraining itself on a broader body of how it treats its own citizens and who gets in and who gets out. And so the Declaration has now become just a rhetorical moral overlay, one in which we can now put all of our own meaning into. We can see it as a clear proclamation that the United States just knew from the beginning, without conquest, as our ambassador declared, that we the people, that all men were created equal. And so this was not to see it instead as not a proclamation of American ideals, but as an argument within positive law that would be moved over time and used by all sorts of people, I think is a much more accurate, empirically accurate, as a historical matter way of viewing the document, and one that I think would help us because it starts to reveal what we are missing, which is this entire legal framework that bound the state, at least poorly, but at least it gave us a space to talk about it for a long time that we've completely lost. We now just see it as, America was great and everyone emulated us and we were so inspiring that everyone in the whole world, including Native people, just wanted to be Americans.
Yes,
and
exactly.
none of that is true.
Right.
But there is something amazing there to really think about in what the Declaration was doing. And I think it's much bigger than I think we're giving it credit for.
Can I give a hard agree to everything that Maggie said, but also supplement that as well? Picking up on one of Martha's very important points, the fact that the Declaration has become revered means it's become defanged. We've lost a sense of its explosive power in 1776 and thereafter, and we've also, particularly by those who most publicly espouse the ideals of the Declaration, particularly on the Supreme Court, it's lost its ability to redirect public discourse. What I'm thinking of here is the fracturing in recent months of what had been a public consensus for almost 150 years in the United States, that the very founding ideals of that country are summed up in the second paragraph, and in particular those opening 5 words, all men are created equal. We now have very senior figures publicly saying in American politics that, I'm going to quote Jamel Bouie, who wrote very powerfully about this, that they do not want to live in Lincoln's America anymore. Men like Eric Schmidt and J.D. Vance say we shouldn't be paying attention to 5 words in the Declaration of Independence. We have to look for other foundations for our identity. What do we have in response to that, for instance, from Justice Thomas, the justice who has quoted the Declaration not just more than any other justice, but by a multiple, I forget what the figure, something like 20 times more than any justice in his decisions. We have from Justice Thomas total silence, no pushback against that. We might even go so far as to say the desecration of the consecration of those ideals as foundational for America. We are seeing a fracturing of that very fundamental public consensus now. Whether the law of nations could save us for that, I do not know, though I totally agree that on the world stage it should be, but we should be at the very least rededicating ourselves to those fundamental meanings which form the public orthodoxy of the United States, but that is beginning to fracture beneath our feet as we speak. Deliberately so.
So I want to make sure we have a bit of time for 1 or 2 questions. I don't know where we are on the clock. We have 2 questions. can you hold your thoughts in response to those two comments? Get some more vox populi, and then... So, who has questions? Let's start on the left-hand side. Whoever gets the mic first, and then we'll move right.
I wonder if the panel can explain a puzzle about the Declaration. The Founding Fathers laid great stress on human rights, natural rights, and in particular they quote John Locke's trilogy, the right to life, the right to liberty, but something went wrong with the third right. It was in relation to the right to land, which they didn't want to include, and so they substituted this rather nebulous thought of everybody's got a right to be happy. Can the panel explain why the plantation owners, most of them were plantation owners, chose to drop the third human right?
That would have been a great question for the first panel. But if we can smuggle that in, why don't we get, Amy, do you have a, there we go.
Hi,
Great.
Thank you so much for the panel. I just had a question, Professor Jones. You mentioned with the story about Abigail in Paris, how Black people didn't need to turn to the Declaration necessarily to call out the hypocrisy of the American slave trade and the institution more broadly. I was wondering if you could just speak on a little bit more whether you feel that we try to kind of collapse or cohere Black or minority thought in the US into like a broad American liberal tradition, and whether or not there are other traditions that they are pulling from or imbuing into broader American politics. So it's not just a kind of coherent line from the Declaration through different civil rights or social justice movements, but there's other kind of traditions being poured into that.
As in, if it's not in the Declaration, it doesn't exist.
Right, exactly.
Problem, yeah.
Right, and then there's other stuff that might be.
Right. Okay, why don't we do a quick, I've lost my timekeeper up here, Amy. Okay, we're done. So you each get two words. I didn't realize the clock, I don't have a, anyway. We'll work from our left to right then.
Well, with respect to land, the question was, of course, the law of nations and the idea of conquest. At the end of the war, you could debate whether or not one had the right of conquest in taking lands, especially from native nations against which the British colonists had just fought. And so over the 1763 proclamation line, Britain said, no, you can't go. We are going to set up troops there, and you are going to pay for them to keep settlers from moving across the proclamation line, which will be immediately negotiated. That was not satisfactory, such as we see the revolution follows from that. But the question then of the right to land afterwards, what you had is a document that wasn't necessarily written by people on the frontier who were largely living in and within Native nations, wearing Native clothing, speaking Native languages. These were men who often engaged in large-scale land speculation. And so these were landholders themselves who would come into the same areas, and the idea of expansion very quickly went to a small percentage of former British colonists. So dispossession didn't serve the broader base of British colonial subjects who had revolted. And I think the drafters of the Declaration were in part aware of that dynamic because they themselves had been buying up Western lands. Washington even went and surveyed his lands beforehand. This was not an unusual topic. So the idea of dispossession, I think, is important, but the idea of conquest and the fact that the United States was founded on this notion that there would be the right to conquer and then move forward, also finding rights to land and conquest, is an important reflection that there wasn't an abandonment of that. There was actually, the British colonial system went over the Northwest Territory immediately. Yeah. And it was the first colony, they declared, of the United States. And so this is not, it was clear what they were and weren't doing, and we need to see that within the founding documents as well.
That it too is a right, or asserted as a right. David.
3 sentences on
Yes.
John Locke. First sentence, the influence of John Locke on the Declaration has been massively overestimated. Number 2, Locke in the second treatise refers not to life, liberty, and property, but lives, liberties, and estates. Estates including possessions, property, but also rights. And the right to use one's body is part of that. Number 3, the Declaration of Independence that does include the words life, liberty, and property or possessions is the Liberian Declaration of Independence, where it's hugely important for formerly enslaved persons who had themselves been property to assert their right to property. I think that was 3 sentences.
Perfect.
Promise.
Martha, the bar is high now.
It is. I think it's useful, in response to your question, to remind us that anti-slavery, opposition to slavery, slave revolt doesn't begin and isn't inspired by the Declaration. The Declaration recognizes that problem, but the resistance, the opposition that is anti-slavery is much older than the document. And so I think there's a problem, right, that's partly, I would ascribe it to historians, right, and to not only the way we periodize the past, but the way we silo the past, and we tell this story as a national story, sort of constrains our ability to see the way in which the Declaration emerges from and is embedded in a world in which the question of slavery versus liberty is a hemispheric one, if not a global one, and the Declaration is one, if you will, data point, rather than an origin point for how we understand that problem.
Terrific. Emma, last words.
Just echo that. I mean, I think that part of the historical story about the Declaration as a founding moment that set forward a set of ideals that have been gradually fulfilling their own logic is an ideological story, and it's one that takes on particular valences in the 20th century, but it's one that when we look at people invoking the Declaration and making use of it later, we shouldn't believe that that's testament to the initial power of the document, but that that's a creative act that those people are engaging in, or if they're citing other things, that's a choice as well. And the meaning of the document doesn't lie just in that initial moment and then sort of roll out to the present, but is made and remade over time.
Yeah. Super. Thank you to the 4 of you for wonderful.
Hello, everybody. This session is going to be slightly different, so a little change in the format. My name is Kasia Boddy, and I teach American literature here in Cambridge. And today I have the great honor and pleasure of introducing Natasha Trethewey, who we're delighted could join us today. Board of Trustees Professor of English at Northwestern University, Natasha Trethewey is the author. Can we get the next slide up? So I'll get my, okay. Is the author of many books, as you can see, across different genres. Beyond Katrina is an exploration of the Mississippi Gulf Coast and the hurricane's ongoing impact. The House of Being, a lecture in a series on why I write. A Memorial Drive, the autobiography of the tragedy of her mother's murder. First and foremost, however, Trethewey is a poet, the author of 5 collections that variously explore the intersections of private and public life, of personal and national history, all versions, as she says, of people in relation to other people. From 2012 to 2014, Trethewey served as US Poet Laureate based at the Library of Congress, a role which she said allowed her to put herself in a place where history lives. And making history live is one of the things that she does so well. Consider Native Guard, you see on the screen, the collection which won her a Pulitzer Prize in 2007. The book's title refers to the Louisiana Native Guards, the first official regiment of Black soldiers in the Union Army, based on Ship Island in the Gulf of Mississippi. Trethewey, who was born and spent her early childhood in Gulfport, writes about how each 4th of July, her grandmother would take her there for a picnic. A plaque recorded the names of the Confederate soldiers who had been held prisoner on the island, but there was no mention of the native guards. Trethewey reclaims that story, and more generally, her work takes on the challenge of bringing readers, she puts it, face to face with what is not remembered, and of revealing what she's called the dark subtext of American history. She's written movingly about her grandmother's house in Gulfport, located at the crossroads of Interstate 49, the southern terminus of one of the great blues highways, and Jefferson Street. She locates herself firmly at the violent crossroads, which she calls the violent crossroads, not just of those roads, but of the histories, traditions, and languages that each represents. Her work and her life navigate, she says, between the vernacular knowledge of Highway 49 and the classical tradition and Enlightenment values of Thomas Jefferson. And that's my cue to hand over to Natasha, but please, first of all, join me in welcoming her here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's lovely to be here with you. In his notes on the state of Virginia, published in 1785, Thomas Jefferson expounded on his ideas about racial difference and hierarchy, being codified as well at that moment by other Enlightenment thinkers. When I was growing up, I had many conversations with my father about Jefferson. My father was also a poet and an English professor. He was my white parent, and in 1965, he and my mother had to break the law to be married. Though he loved me dearly, he couldn't fully unyoke himself from those deeply ingrained ideas of difference and hierarchy, though he understood the unfinished project of American democracy and our nation's roots in and history of white supremacy. In order to have a difficult conversation with him in the only language that he would really listen to, which was the language of poetry, I had to take him back to Monticello, Jefferson's home, where he had first taken me 30 years before. At Monticello, whereas it used to be taboo to bring up Sally Hemings, it is now the official position of the Jefferson Foundation that he fathered several of Hemings' children. And because of this, the conversations that you might overhear at Monticello have changed, though the underlying ideology has not. This is Enlightenment. In the portrait of Jefferson that hangs at Monticello, he is rendered two-toned, his forehead white with illumination, a lit bulb, the rest of his face in shadow, darkened as if the artist meant to contrast his bright knowledge, its dark subtext. By 1805, when Jefferson sat for the portrait, he was already linked to an affair with his slave. Against a backdrop blue and ethereal, a wash of paint that seems to hold him in relief, Jefferson gazes out across the centuries, his lips fixed as if he's just uttered some final word. The first time I saw the painting, I listened as my father explained the contradictions, how Jefferson hated slavery, though out of necessity, my father said, had to own slaves. That his moral philosophy meant he could not have fathered those children, would have been impossible, my father said. For years, we debated the distance between word and deed. I'd follow my father from book to book, gathering citations, listen as he named, like a field guide to Virginia, each flower and tree and bird, as if to prove a man's pursuit of knowledge is greater than his shortcomings, the limits of his vision. I did not know then the subtext of our story, that my father could imagine Jefferson's words made flesh in my flesh, the improvement of the blacks in body and mind in the first instance of their mixture with the whites, or that my father could believe he'd made me better. When I think of this now, I see how the past holds us captive, its beautiful ruin etched on the mind's eye. My young father, a rough outline of the old man he's become, needing to show me the better measure of his heart, an equation writ large at Monticello. That was years ago. Now we take in how much has changed. Talk of Sally Hemings, someone asking, how white was she? Parsing the fractions as if to name what made her worthy of Jefferson's attentions, a near-white quadroon mistress, not a plain black slave. Imagine stepping back into the past, our guide tells us then, and I can't resist whispering to my father, this is where we split up. I'll head around to the back. When he laughs, I know he's grateful I've made a joke of it, this history that links us, white father, black daughter, even as it renders us other to each other.
Thank you, Natasha. Natasha's going to read some more poems in a moment, but I'm just going to ask a few questions about Enlightenment and more generally the processes of her and the concerns of her poetry before we do that. I was going to ask you about Enlightenment is one of several poems, many poems that begin with an image, painting or a photograph, and you've spoken about those as providing documentary evidence of history. But you've also described, you talk about the active imagination required, you say not to look not simply at the pictures, but somehow through them. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could say a bit more about that process.
Well, for me as a poet, it really helps to begin in an image, something that I might start describing that helps me enter history in a way. I mean, I tend to choose either photographs or paintings that begin to tell me something about the particular historical question that I'm dealing with. And so that poem, for example, comes from a collection of mine called Thrall that also considers the Mexican Costa paintings of the 18th century, where across the century they represented the interracial unions taking place in the colony and the offspring of those unions. Another begins with altarpieces and paintings from the 14th century that recount the 12th century miracle of the brothers Cosmas and Damian, who were the patron saints of medicine. And in all of these images, the patron saints of medicine are trying to replace the diseased, gangrenous leg of a white sacristan with a leg by a black donor. And often that they were told to do this by angels, and often the donor is someone that they dig up and desecrate the grave and take the leg from. Later on, they actually start taking the leg from a live donor. And these images are represented across many centuries and many different countries. And so when I'm trying to get at ideas that have been with us for a very long time about, I'll say it plainly like this, whose lives seem to matter across time and space more than the lives of others, those images show that, because always the white sacristan is placed on a bed or somewhere up high, and always either the body of the deceased black person is either in a grave or on the ground below, having been plundered.
You also just now reading Enlightenment introduced the idea of seeing one thing the first time you look, mm-hmm. and then when you come back to it a second time or a third time, seeing something different. And I wonder, you've also talked about the necessity, you say, not only to say something, but to say it again. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about repetition, about re-seeing and rewriting, mm-hmm. and those processes.
A lot of the poems that are in my collection, Native Guard, that you mentioned that deal with the Black Union soldiers, what I was trying to do was to inscribe a history onto the American landscape and into the American psyche that had, in many ways, been erased. And as we are seeing right now, things are being erased yet again. And it seemed important to me at that point not just to say the thing, but to say it again, because it was about a kind of restorative inscription.
And the idea of re-seeing something, that you go back to it a second time and you see things?
Well, yes. Even when I started working on the poems about the Mexican Costa paintings, I was mainly interested in the ways that we might see representations of mixed families during the Enlightenment. What I didn't realize that the poem was revealing to me was how much that was a conversation I needed to have with my father. The poet Mark Doty says our metaphors go on ahead of us. And so to begin in describing an image or a scene is one way of allowing the metaphor that's going ahead of me for me to catch up to it and to see differently and to see again what else the image is telling me.
Which is also something you do in your memoir, where you're talking about looking at family photographs more than once and seeing different things.
Right. Those little punctums that strike us.
But I suppose one thing is it gives a kind of sense of historical evidence being quite slippery and quite, how reliable is it if we see things differently each time we look. And I wondered more generally, we're having this conversation about history and what the role of poetry is in that conversation. Poetry certainly operates differently. And you're talking about metaphor moving ahead, and also your poems are kind of beautifully, meticulously ordered, formally. So what does poetry bring to the conversation about history?
Well, I think when people encounter a poem, you are able to, because of the intimacy of the voice, you are able to say, to contend with difficult knowledge, and in ways that you might not be able to in our sort of ordinary rhetoric, and particularly in our very charged rhetoric that we see. People, I think, feel a little bit more open to the kinds of things you might hear in a poem. I remember when I first went to Washington to be briefed about the role of the poet laureate, one of the things that they told me is that my predecessor, the late Phil Levine, who was, in his 80s at the time, who said exactly what he thought, had gotten in trouble because he gave an interview in which he said that Congress was a den of vipers. But the Library of Congress and the Poet Laureate position was a position created by an act of Congress, and so they don't exactly want you to offend Congress. So what they told me is that I could say anything I wanted to as long as I said it in the language of a poem.
Interesting, yeah.
It looks like I'm supposed to do that now.
No, it's fine. No, thank you. Well, this is my last question, and which sort of follows on from that. And one of the things I think that your poems do is encourage readers to think about history as kind of existing in layers, or that one historical moment should be thought of in relation to another and to the present, of course. And you've said that this is not just about creating a fuller version of history, but considering things that might change in the future. And I was wondering, is that why you've written that the making of a poem is one of the most hopeful acts?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think of the making of a poem as a hopeful act, because poems often show us the world as it could be.
And maybe you will give us some examples of that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. couple of years ago, I was asked to write a commemorative poem for the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And the Tulsa Race Massacre was when a white mob descended on this affluent African-American community of Greenwood, which was home of Black Wall Street, and looted and burned blacks' homes, stealing or destroying their wealth. This is one of the histories that is frequently written out of history textbooks, and with the kinds of laws that have been passed around in various states in the United States right now, it is getting harder and harder to teach certain kinds of histories that reveal the truth about our past. I'd like to just mention that when I was there, it was sort of the end of the dig that they were doing at a mass grave, where a lot of the bodies of the victims had been buried. They were trying to find out if they could identify through DNA evidence who these people were. One of them that they did manage to identify was a soldier on his way home, a World War I veteran on his way home to Georgia. And they know this because they matched the DNA to the letter that he wrote to his family saying that he was stopping off in Tulsa on his way home. This is Ground Truth, Notes for a Poem on the Tulsa Race Massacre. The first day I spent in Tulsa, I woke to a parade gathering outside my window. A commemoration begun in 1918 as Armistice Day, marking the end of the Great War. At the corner of Elgin and Archer, I was just blocks from the place I'd come to see, the heart of it, Black Wall Street, yet another site steeped in the residue of history, of white mob violence settled down in the soil. Watching the staging area, the flatbed trucks lining the route, I couldn't stop seeing scenes of the invasion, massacre in Greenwood, the dead hauled away, black men paraded through the streets, women and children rounded up for internment, carted through town through the jeering cheers of whites. Some of them, survivors recalled, boys, young as 10 years old. Call it coincidence or synchronicity, the term Carl Jung gave to the phenomenon of events coinciding as if related but with no causal connection. The morning of the parade, I wasn't thinking of armistice, nor that you could trace the events of 1921 back to the war, to black soldiers come back determined to end Jim Crow, to fight for democracy at home. I was thinking only of how many times I'd heard a similar story, the same equation, whites incited to violence by an accusation, false or not, a through line across time and space as far north as Duluth, Minnesota, 1920, where a white mob abducted 3 black men from jail and hanged them from a lamppost. South to my home state, Mississippi, 1955, the seed barn where white men tortured Emmett Till, a black child, for whistling at a white woman. The bridge over the Tallahatchie where they tied him with barbed wire to a fan, a bullet in his head, and dumped his body in the river. Days later, a revelation. Snag in the water where he would not be held down, his body come back, a single toe rising above the surface as if to signal, I am here, you will not erase me, my body of evidence. Some say coincidence is pattern revealed. Decades before Till would become another item in our national ledger, citizens of Greenwood were reading the papers, watching the patterns emerge, white mob violence, lynching, and Negro drives, blacks run out of town, their homes looted and burned. In Wilmington, North Carolina, 1898, Springfield, Illinois, 1908, Forsyth County, Georgia, 1912, East St. Louis, 1917, Chicago, 1919, item, item, item. They were watching patterns of rhetoric, language, evidence of thought, as in Nab Negro, the headline in the Tulsa Tribune that day in May. How not to read in it the syntax of the imperative, as in a thing still to be done, a call to action. One witness swore he saw the words lynch Negro that day in the paper, where there was only nab Negro and a poem. Do it now about swatting flies. We must show no ruth or pity to the fly. In the country or the city, he must die. From this distance, I can still see the connections, the inference, like the rhyme I heard a white boy chant when we were children in school. Niggers and flies I do despise. Nab Negro, do it now. In Tulsa, on Veterans Day, a retired Army officer was talking unity, saying brothers and sisters, saying those who served can come together, show support, share commonalities, love each other. But I don't know. After January 6th, it's harder to believe those words. It took 120 years for Congress to pass an anti-lynching law named for Emmett Till. The year before he was murdered, Eisenhower changed Armistice Day to Veterans Day, a way to include more veterans, more wars. But I can't help thinking in metaphor, how it replaced a word that meant suspension of fighting, hostile behavior. That was 1954, the same year as the Brown decision, ending segregation, advancing civil rights, the kind of change in America that has always led to rage, recalcitrance. To send a message, new monuments to white supremacy went up around the country. A bronze Robert E. Lee in Montgomery, Alabama, a Robert E. Lee Elementary in Washington State, the Confederate battle flag raised again on the flagpole in Georgia, statues mustered as far north as Maine, as far west as Oregon. Continuity, too, is pattern. In Tulsa, there were nearly as many people at the parade as the mob that descended on Greenwood, and I can't help imagining the possibility of that much remembering, reckoning, armistice. Watching the news, I wondered how many of them, so close to the massacre, the ground on which they paraded, remembered it or recalled the service of black soldiers in World War I, how one black unit, the 369th, spent more time at the front, suffered more casualties than any other American troops, how some black soldiers returned and were lynched in uniform, sometimes by white brothers because they were in uniform. Even now, they get lost in our national memory, the gaps and erasures, a whites-only version of a segregated war. Think of it, 1921, those black veterans in uniform marching to the courthouse to prevent a lynching, uphold the rule of law, and the white mob they faced. I keep thinking how much it would matter if this history were part of our American curriculum, if every child learned it in school, all of it, despite feeling shame for the actions of people in the past, a feeling akin to empathy. A generous thought, my father always said, is the idea of justice taking root, a kind of redress, which is why I go back to one postcard of the burning, how the photographer must have shot from high above, a God's eye view, words forming in his mind as if he'd been deputized to write the scripture of this scene, a long road upon which a few people have gathered, perhaps to take a last look, smoke darkening the distant sky, and above them, in white, the words, "Ruining the Negro out of Tulsa." Coincidence, his misspelling, heavy with meaning for someone like me who can't help seeking it everywhere, a way to make order out of the chaos of this world. Ruining, word for making a song of lamentation, a poem of mourning, which is what this is. What I'm trying to say is that to understand America, I spent the day in Tulsa thinking about democracy, standing on Greenwood, sifting through the archives and watching from a distance the slow unearthing of history settle down in the soil. Exhumation of the long buried in a mass grave at Oaklawn, evidence of the nearly erased rising now to the surface like a reckoning, a toehold on the truth. In this last poem, I mentioned Loving versus the state of Virginia, which 1967, when the Supreme Court struck down the anti-miscegenation laws, ruling that the state laws ruling against interracial marriage were unconstitutional. And this is Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black writing in 1964, No right is more precious in a free country than that of having a voice in the election of those who make the laws under which, as good citizens, we must live. Other rights, even the most basic, are illusory if the right to vote is undermined. Quotidian. Sometimes she wrote about the weather, how hot it was, or yet another lightning storm gone as quick as it came. In the catalog of her days, a dress she was sewing, car trouble, payday, laced with declarations of love to the man who would become my father. Her body bright with desire, a threshold I would soon cross into being. 2 years before loving will make their love legal, my mother writes about marrying despite an unjust law. And because it is 1965, Mississippi in turmoil, she writes about a cross burned at the church next door, interracial outings at the beach, and being followed by police, all of it side by side in her letters' tidy script. Reading them, I can't help thinking how ordinary it seems, injustice, mundane as a trip to the store for bread. And I know this is about what has always existed side by side in this country. That summer, my grandmother brought the movement home. It tells the story in pictures, and it is beautiful, my mother wrote, adding, I think you know the way I'm using the word. On the cover, a black protester caught in a cop's chokehold, his mouth open to shout or gasp for air. Inside, pictures I could not bear to look at as a child, a man tied to a scaffold, his body burned blacker, the fire still smoldering beneath him. 2 boys hanged from a tree above the smiling white faces of the revelers turned back toward the camera, a young couple holding hands, ordinary as any night out on a date. Now I think of my mother, in love and writing love letters, cataloging her days, those terrible, beautiful pictures on the table next to the crocheted lace doily and crystal bowl my grandmother kept for candy, butterscotch in cellophane wrappers, bright and shiny as gold. It is July 20th, 1965, 2 months before my parents will break the law to be married, and my mother, who's just turned 21, signs off, her rights basic as any other citizen's. Have to run, she wrote, got to get downtown to register, to vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. Everybody, join us once more in thanking her for that wonderful reading.
Okay, wonderful. Well, following Natasha is a very tough challenge. I mean, what an amazing presentation and what an amazing person she is. Memorial Road is an amazing book for those of you who haven't read it. But those of you who don't know, my name's Gillian Tett. I'm Provost of King's. I'm also a columnist at the FT. And I'm also, as it happens, both American and British. And I think everyone on this panel is American as well. I myself, as it happens, went to Monticello last month to try and pay homage to the 250th anniversary. The good news is, for those of you who haven't been to Monticello recently, and I urge you all to go, is that these days they do indeed have a fantastic exhibition about the slaves and about the Hemming family, and a big tour, which is what I started with. The bad news is that the tour guide told me they still get quite a lot of the white visitors saying, this can't really be true, can it? And therein lies the challenge today, both for all of us and for America. And I'm just curious before I start, how many people in the room are American? Wow, okay. Well, that's fantastic. I say that's fantastic because, you know, King's College was founded in 1441 by King Henry VI, who wrote about it saying that he wanted it to be a place of quiet reflection, because if you didn't have those places of quiet reflection, government and society would fall apart. And he wrote about it because Britain was going through, or England was going through, a vicious civil war at the time that lasted 100 years. So it was kind of a port in an intellectual storm. And I kind of imagine that today, Cambridge as a whole is almost playing the same role, because we are a place that can keep the flame of liberal democracy or democratic values and rational discussion alive, even as it's sometimes challenging back in America today. So, on that note, it's wonderful to be here. The topic of our panel is, does the Declaration still matter? So, before I go down and ask you each that question, I want to quickly ask the audience one more question, which is, who in the room today thinks that America is still honoring the Declaration in the way that it is organizing itself right now? All of those who think that America is still honoring the Declaration, raise your hands. Okay, those who fear that it is not, and there's more work to be done, raise your hands. That's pretty clear. We have an amazing panel to talk about this. I'm not going to spend time introducing them one by one, but we have, of course, Jared Golden, who's US Representative for Maine's 2nd Congressional District. Thank you for coming over for this. Jamel Bouie from the New York Times, Heather Ann Thompson from the University of Michigan, and our very own Caroline Johnston, who teaches American history here and has just got a permanent job. So congratulations. And Caroline, since I put you on the spotlight, do you think that America is upholding the values of the Declaration today?
It depends, I guess, on how you define the values of the Declaration. And we've talked about for a long time today how flexible those boundaries actually are. If we're talking about the way that democracies agree on what equality and democracy are, then I would say no.
Right. What about you, Jamel?
I'm also very tempted to give the "it depends on what you mean" answer. I think that there are obviously different, like there's the Declaration of Independence, but it's been held and considered and read by different groups of Americans in different ways, right? And so the way I would prefer to understand the Declaration, which is Lincoln's Declaration, which I think in a real sense, even our commemorations of the 250th are really commemorations of Lincoln's Declaration. This is the Declaration that really is rooted in this idea of equality of people, and that being a part of not just American ideals, but the constitutional system itself. I would say that Lincoln's Declaration, it's having some hard times these days, some difficult times, is under assault by powerful forces in American government. And those powerful forces, they would not say that they, well, some of them would say they reject the Declaration, but the less forthright amongst them may say that, yes, we still value the Declaration and we value the Declaration of Independence, but their declaration, you might say, is Roger Taney's declaration. It's a declaration as understood by people who saw it as an exclusive document, right? As something that referred to a very specific strata of Americans and no one else. And so that declaration, having a good time. And that's how I might put it.
Well, that's very well put. What about you, Heather?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Jamel. I think the Declaration, the way that I think we've understood it for many years in the country, in some respects has been fulfilled. that some of the architects of the Declaration they've realized a lot of what they've wanted. The more aspirational elements of the Declaration, the ones that people have clung to as this is what it still needs to be, this is what it still could be, are what is in jeopardy. And interestingly, I think for the forces in the United States who still have hope for the country, the Declaration has gone from being a document that we critique and a document that we have deep troubles with to a document that it becomes, I don't know, something that its basic principles we are all feeling like we're struggling to preserve.
Right, so now it's as much of a challenge as an actual celebration, if you like, in that respect. As why I was asking the question. And Jared, excuse me for being British and calling you by your first name. I often get in trouble in Washington when I do that. But I'd like to say, first of all, thank you for your service, to use a very popular American word, because it is not easy to choose to be in Congress these days, least of all to choose to be in Congress and seek to try and take, a rational, friendly, sometimes bipartisan approach to issues. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you for your service. In terms of how you see it, sitting in Washington, do you think America's living up to its Declaration of Independence?
I think that people are trying to. I think most Americans believe that and are still committed to it. And I would agree that there are people who would have an exclusionary vision of what that means. And I still believe that the majority of Americans don't agree with them about that, and that they're doing, in their own way, honor to the document of the Declaration of Independence through their own acts. By the way, call me Jared anytime. I tell people all the time. I prefer it. I think that most Americans could at least agree. I mean, we've listened to the discussions most of our lives, the debate about whether or not we are living up to the values upheld, things, simple equality of all people. No. Throughout history, it's fallen short. But I think that most Americans are in agreement that it is a visionary document that we should hold up as a standard to strive towards and then use as a guide. But one of the things I wanted to share today, just from the perspective of someone in Congress today, is that when I read, I studied early colonial American history when I got out of the service years ago. I'm not anywhere near at the level of academia or a historian by any means, but when I read some of the words, the original words of some of the framers, they were aware of their shortcomings, of some of the hypocrisy of the time. But as they were really envisioning and laying out a vision for self-governance, which was one of the creative things that they were declaring at the time, is we can actually set this up and people can self-govern. I don't think that they ever promised that it would be easy, and I think that they often reflected or forecasted into the future that it would be a never-ending challenge from one generation to the next.
Right.
And so I think that's really, in a way, how each generation of Americans has to do honor to the Declaration of Independence, and recognizing that even if we were to achieve this ultimate vision, it doesn't mean that it would be safe. You could backslide. We'll always have to be on guard in striving for this perfection that has never been fully realized.
Right, so in that sense, the Declaration definitely does matter, because it gives us, a vision of what we should be striving for, and we'll never quite hit, but should keep struggling. But the reason that matters is because, of course, we are about to enter party season, as far as President Trump is concerned, which are the celebrations for the 250th anniversary. Now, if you are true to the Declaration, these shouldn't be organized in a very democratic, grassroots way with full engagement of as many people as possible. But I'm curious, and I'll start with you, Jared. It seems from the outside that this is being basically staged by the president and the White House. As a member of Congress, are you involved, or is Congress involved in trying to work out how these celebrations are going to actually happen or not?
No. And that's true of this administration on many issues, but on this one in particular, it's a firm no. They're moving forward with their own plans, their own vision. The military parade they did is another version of this. That was last year. Just looking back as a Marine, we never cared about the pomp and circumstance and the parades and things of that nature. I think you could actually see that reflected in the march itself. People that want to serve are there to serve in real ways. And I guess I have to admit, paid much attention to how this administration will choose to celebrate it. I think that at the grassroots level is where it belongs, and I think many people are going to be doing that work despite what they might not like about the work that will be done by this administration at the federal level.
And what are you going to be doing yourself in your district?
The typical thing is to march in a local 4th of July parade and spend time in those communities. You try and rotate them as best you can. I mean, I represent well over 300 towns, so can't be everywhere at once. To bring my family, my young daughters and my wife is always something that they have enjoyed through the years. And I think that's just important to do it together in a community. And I'll share a story with you about when I realized why it was important, because you think politicians just go to these things and maybe people don't really care. And actually, a number of people will yell out at any politician in a parade basically what they think of you and that they wish you weren't there. But I was the first federal official of Maine's delegation to ever acknowledge that the Wabanaki tribe in Maine should have sovereignty. They are one of the few in America who are federally recognized but are not considered sovereign. I'm not going to get into the complexities of that, but the year that I made the push to at least try and pass legislation to do it, we all knew that we would not be successful, but we thought having that debate and getting it out there was an important step. And I think it'll get done in the future, but some young members of the Passamaquoddy tribe, these are teenagers, 15 to 18 years old, dressed up like they had just come from basketball practice, asked if they could march alongside myself and my team. And I said, sure, but when I asked why, they said, because you're the first person in Maine at the federal level who's ever even tried or heard us and know that this matters to us. And it was important to them to not only that I would be there, that they could walk with me. And just seeing that they were very proud in that moment. I mean, I don't know if you know what I'm getting at here. But
absolutely, and this is why symbols and rituals matter enormously. And also why what is actually on display in July this year matters enormously. Because it's both, I mean, I'm trained as a cultural anthropologist, and rituals and symbols both represent the past, but then shape the future in terms of what they display. And on that note, Jamel, I'd like to ask you, so what do you think about the way that the celebrations are being staged at the moment?
Yeah.
What would you like to see, and what do you think you are going to see?
I mean, I wouldn't like to see this. I think that, so the president doesn't have, in my view, any real conception of the significance of the Declaration of Independence or of the 250th other than as some opportunity for him to show himself off in the way typical of would-be autocrats. I don't think he really has any higher sense of what this moment could be about and what we're actually commemorating here. And I think this celebration, as it's unfolding in DC, is reflective of that. They're building, I don't know if you've seen the pictures, easy to find, they're building like a big UFC cage thing at the White House. If you like bad movies, it actually right now looks like the giant mechanical spider from 1998's Wild Wild West. They're planning a weigh-in at the Lincoln Memorial, which I actually find genuinely offensive. The cage match thing is it's like funny, but the weigh-in at the Lincoln Memorial is I think a real problem. And it's all just a big spectacle. Yeah. They announced a slate of performers, big stars like Milli Vanilli and Bret Michael of Poison, people who are clearly on the radio right now. And actually, a bunch of them have pulled out, which is funny to me. So this celebration really has nothing to do with the moment, with the time. It's even hard to say it's a celebration of the United States in a meaningful sense. It's just a celebration of Trump's own kind of personality, attempt to build this cult of personality. What I would like to see, right, in Washington at the very least, would be something with the vibe. You mentioned you were in Monticello last month. So every July 4th at Monticello, there's a citizenship ceremony where they swear in new American citizens. I had the opportunity to go to it 2 summers ago, and it's, even for someone who's like relatively jaded about these things, it's like genuinely moving and beautiful to see people who have worked very hard and tried very hard, people of different races, nationalities, and ethnicities gathered together at the mountaintop at Monticello. There's a live reading of the Declaration of Independence, and then they give their oath of citizenship, and it's really beautiful. And I don't know if you need something like that in DC, but something with that vibe, something that is really attesting to the nation's highest aspirations, and something that is broad and inclusive and meant to showcase sort of the best of what the country can be.
Right. I mean, I'm kind of curious. I'd love to ask the 2 academics here who have been looking back at American history. So in theory, what we're celebrating in July is a revolution, but do you think it's feasible for America to still imagine that it's a revolutionary state forever? Has it become the anti-revolutionary state now? Or is President Trump trying to create a new revolution? I mean, should we stop focusing so much on the revolution per se? I mean, Caroline, you must think about this in your work.
Yeah, I mean, I think you see a lot of nods to the revolutionary spirit. You often see it in advertising, so I think it's more often trying to get you to buy something, which is not necessarily politically revolutionary. It's just good marketing. But when we talk about the kind of like symbols that you see around commemoration, and I think why it's difficult to say what we want to see is because it's difficult to figure out how to express patriotism in the moment. And I think that that's because there's a rise in nationalism, and nationalism relies on patriotism. But nationalism wants to sacrifice others in order to kind of cleanse the nation, whereas there's other ways to use the nation and its laws, right? You can use it as a shield, you can use it as a symbol. We see it in these flags and the photos right above. So whether that's revolutionary, I don't know, and I don't think it is, because it's still using kind of symbols from the past to say that we need to change the present. But I think it's worth thinking about, where the nation fits into what you're trying to do.
Right.
Especially
and
now.
Heather, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm also not sure whether it's revolutionary, but I do think that what's happening right now in Washington, D.C. with the commemoration, I think actually is pretty important, even though I fully agree with you, Jamel, that for Trump personally, it is about the pomp and circumstance of being an autocrat and being adored. But the actual trappings of all of that, I think, is part of a revolution that certainly MAGA would like to have and certain people in Washington would like to have, which is to co-opt and to take what the Declaration, really what America is supposed to be about, and to claim it, to own it, to reshape it, and to wave it and wrap it in a flag and say, this is the America you want, this is the America that we really are. And I think that actually matters a lot because it elides so much of where they came from, what they want to undo. And one of the deep ironies is that, of course, they are there in no small part to undo all of the successes of those who saw the Declaration as aspirational. They are there to undo the people who actually thought that maybe liberty meant something, or justice might have meant something, or that happiness, basic happiness for ordinary people might have meant something. So I actually think these cultural wars are deeply, deeply important, and therefore commemorations are important. And yet this is also such stark relief because, of course, if you were to have commemorations of what was made possible out of the principles of the Declaration, it would much more resemble, the immigration celebrations, the Cinco de Mayos, the Juneteenth celebrations, a Labor Day parade. It would look completely different. And so I think it actually matters that it's instead being evoked as a cage fight and instead being evoked as all you need to look at is the flag. All you need to look at is the red, white, and blue, and not think at all about what the principles actually are.
About the idea. Of course, the ambassador earlier spoke about the idea, or that America was created by an idea.
Exactly.
But I'm kind of curious because Heather, you've looked a lot at the kind of fracturing of the media. To what degree do you think that's part of the problem with trying to create any common narrative today? Because we've had the freedom trucks going around. We've had plenty of Fox TV discussion about the 250th anniversary. But, of course, we have an entirely different perspective in other channels right now. Is it possible to even get a unified view at the moment?
Well, I think it's certainly much more difficult now, and I think it's a challenge, but I think that we actually have to look really carefully at how that happened, how that was created. We promised Nick we wouldn't get into the weeds of our own work, but I will say that part of the weeds that I've been in has been sort of astonished at how much work it actually took to accomplish what you just referenced. It took a lot of work to create this alternative media narrative. It took a lot of work to fan the flames of people's worst impulses rather than their better impulses. It took a lot of effort to take over the media. It took a lot of work to persuade people that truth is not a thing and that facts don't matter. And that is a double-edged sword, right? It gives us a great sense of despair because, implicit in the question is how in the world can we combat that? But it also has its seeds of hope, which is if it takes that much work, it means that in fact in this country, in that country, the one over there is a lot of aspiration still. There's a lot of goodwill. There's a lot of desire for people to actually have equality and justice and all those things because it takes so much work to persuade them that instead what they want is hatred and xenophobia. And that is a hopeful, weirdly hopeful way of thinking about it.
Right. I mean, Jared, I'm curious, you have tried to reach across the aisle. You've tried to work with, a range of different people in Congress, which I deeply salute you for, and it's a tragedy that you're not running for re-election. Do you think, from your perspective in Washington, it's possible to create a unifying vision of what 250th anniversary should be?
That would be hard to do in Congress, but that's in part because you're dealing with, in the House, 435 people, any one of whom could filibuster the entire hour if you were to sit up here. In general, I just don't think that work belongs in Congress per se, but rather with the people. Quickly, I want to pivot back to the celebration. And I don't think we should spend the whole time talking about President Trump, but my perception of the thing is that nothing drives him crazier than being basically irrelevant or ignored. And he will be obsessed with the crowd size. He will talk about how many people, historic numbers of people showed up, and it won't be true. The crowd will be small. And the patriotic viewpoint about what the force should be on the 250th will be, it's not too late for you all, but for many people out there to go replicate today in your own way, in your family, sitting around the table at the barbecue or in your own community, set it up and have these conversations and include people who you don't see eye to eye with per se, and work it out and go out in search of that shared vision if you can. Do I think that the Congress, to come back to your question, is capable of developing such a thing? Yes, in part. That would be a really difficult project, right? But I'll just come back to my first point today, which was, I think most of Congress, like most of the American people, could agree that what resides within the Declaration of Independence, the potential of it, is the standard that we should be striving for.
Right. Jamil, what do you think? Do you think there's any chance of creating a unified narrative?
I've been sitting on this idea of unity just for the simple reason that I often think it's the desire for, how do I put this? Show me when there's been ever for Americans a unified narrative. Last weekend was Memorial Day in the U.S., a holiday that was originally Decoration Day, celebrated by the formerly enslaved, beginning in Charleston, South Carolina, in honor of Union soldiers who had died in a war that eventually had become a war for emancipation. And for many, many, many years, decades, white Southerners did not celebrate Memorial Day. They didn't necessarily celebrate the 4th of July either, seeing it as a holiday for Yankees. So Memorial Day and Independence Day, two kind of major American holidays, for decades, there was a sectional split in the United States over whether you celebrated these, a racial split over whether you celebrated these. When you think of any attempt to tell the larger story of the United States, there are dissenters, there are people who disagree, right? There isn't so much a unified narrative, and I think the most you can hope for in terms of national commemorations and national celebrations is sort of, at the very least, putting forth something that attempts to speak to the broad public and to the broad public's aspirations, however those might look. So, you know, when this isn't a commemoration, but when I think of the former President Barack Obama's speech in 2015 on the occasion of the Charleston Church massacre, that was a speech geared toward this notion of a more perfect union. And obviously, many Americans disagree with the speech, but the register of the speech was trying to pull together some unity in the broad public. And I think that's like the most you can do. And so what's disappointing about the current celebration is that it's not partisan, it's like sectarian, right? It's a very sectarian vision of what the United States is and what its history is. And as per Heather's comment earlier, it really is rooted in this, I would say rooted in this idea of trying to roll back and repudiate the sort of the striving towards egalitarianism that has marked American political life since after the Civil War. You asked earlier if you can think of the United States as a revolutionary state. You know, Eric Foner's great book on Reconstruction is titled Reconstruction, America's Unfinished Revolution. And to the extent that there is anything like revolutionary in American political life, I would say it is this effort, and I would describe Reconstruction as this effort to take the egalitarian values of the Declaration and actually make them part of the political settlement in a real way. Yeah. And that effort, that struggle has been revolutionary in this country. And I understand this administration, the movement behind him, as counter-revolutionary, right? Trying to roll that back to some antebellum status quo ante.
So do you think we should actually be saying we're not going to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the revolution, but the 250th anniversary of the unfinished revolution? Would that be more accurate?
I mean, if I had it my way, we'd all be celebrating sort of like, you know, John Bingham and Charles Sumner. But but I do think that it's not that we shouldn't be marking 1776, but I do think it's actually really important to recognize the way that the Declaration, as many Americans understand it today, is an inheritance not from 1776, but it's an inheritance from 1856. It's an inheritance from 1866. Yeah. It's an inheritance from a period where the nation was being torn apart over this question of whether or not those within it would have some kind of political equality, whether this would be a nation defined by bondage or whether it wouldn't be. And if it wouldn't be, what would it be a nation defined by? And so it's not, again, not that 1776 doesn't matter, but that like the commemoration, I think, needs to take stock of the fact that in a very real, literal sense, like the United States as we know it is the United States built from the aftermath of the Civil War, and not so much from the aftermath of the Revolutionary War.
Right. I can see you nodding, Heather.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think that there were also, as we've heard in these earlier panels, there were extraordinary struggles that also follow 1776 to consider what this new nation would look like and what rights would be within it and who had a say in it and who was recognized within it. So, but there is something about the battle over human bondage and not just that, but the battle between capital and labor, whether or not this country was going to be an oligarchy, whether or not the wealthiest people were going to get to decide everything and own everything, or whether wealth would be distributed in any way downward, and whether there would be any equality between labor and capital. So between those poles, or between those controversies, to use a term today, created enormous activism to making that more perfect union that Barack Obama then evokes years later. But I also think it's fair to say, to your earlier question about, can there be unity? I mean, I think what's really extraordinary is that fast forward even further after the New Deal, I mean, whether you were a Republican or whether you were a Democrat, there was at least some baseline understanding that the nation had a responsibility, for example, to take care of people who could not take care of themselves for whatever reason, because they were unemployed, because they might be suffering a disability, any number of reasons, right? And that there was a role for government that was a redistributive role, a protective role, and that we all had to pay into that, and that we all would benefit, we all could, even if we did not yet, could benefit from that. Public schools, public roads, protection of our food supply, any number of these. And what has happened recently is a rejection of that. And it took enormous effort to get people who relied on those resources to decide that somehow they weren't as important as getting immigrants out of the American landscape, or somehow it wasn't as important as being able to carry a gun and shoot somebody if you wanted to. But at the end of the day, that there was a unity in that. And I think that is kind of, if you think about the rhetoric today, that's what people are kind of evoking again. Like, we may not agree on the path, but can we at least agree that if you live in this country, that there are certain things that you should be able to expect and you should be able to count on?
Right.
Maybe that's what we should not be commemorating, but actually reckoning with right now.
Right. Caroline, I'm going to come to you just a moment. I can see that Jared's keen to get in. Tell us. Well, and then I would ask Jared.
Yeah, I mean, when we're thinking about the New Deal, it's also important to recognize that from the start, the way that the New Deal coalition was held together was with these exceptions, right? Excluding the majority of Black Americans. And the second that was amended, the cracks started to show.
Exactly.
Which does not mean that what is happening now was ever inevitable, but that this is a long-standing struggle within the United States between people's definition of humanity and equality and rights. And I think that, I guess there's some hopelessness in that, and there's also some hope in terms of being able to look at the past and see a path forward.
All right.
Yeah, just sitting here, it dawns on me listening to my friends up here that your question in some ways was unfair. Like, can I see a unified vision coming out of Congress? Like, could we see a unified future for the United States of America? I think, actually, what I do believe is that in my bipartisan work, I could probably get a very large body of the Congress to acknowledge that we will never be fully unified as a country. And that's okay, and that we should embrace that, as long as we are doing it in the right way. What we should celebrate is 250 years of democracy. We are the longest living democracy ever. And it's a choice whether or not we will continue to be so going forward. I would suggest to people that the alternatives are not good that are out there. What would that look like? For some people think they don't want democracy anymore. It looks pretty dark to me, but I think that's what we need to celebrate.
So you think number one priority is to celebrate democracy on July the 4th?
And the fact that we have a choice to look past our differences,
right,
choose to live peacefully together, respectfully together, and keep striving towards that standard that is laid out in the founding document.
Right. That's a very, very inspiring vision of what to celebrate on July the 4th. What would you celebrate? What's the top priority for July the 4th for you?
For me?
Yes.
Okay. I wasn't sure you were pointing in.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was, yes.
Me specifically.
Yes.
I mean, Anna's top priority, right, is like, I'm gonna grill, you know, man. I'm gonna put some ribs on the grill. But more high-minded top priority is, I very much think that July 4th, this commemoration, this celebration is, it is, given the current political environment in the country, I think it's actually really important to celebrate the nation's pluralism, to celebrate the nation's sort of striving towards a more kind of robust self-government, and to very much, you might say like a cringe way, like embrace the fact that even for all of our division and fractitiousness, this is the United States. I think it's a remarkable example of how cultural diversity and pluralism can work, and it doesn't take away from anything, and it in fact really sort of like it strengthens, I think, American identity in a really vital and important way.
Right.
That's sort of the opposite of what we're getting from the people in power. I watched Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's address to what graduates at West Point or the Naval Academy, where he was mocking the idea that diversity was the nation's strength. And I think this 4th of July, and I'll refer back to my mention of the citizenship ceremony in Monticello. I think this 4th of July is a moment to embrace all that the administration is projecting about, I think, America's best and most aspirational self.
Right. Caroline and then Heather. I'm going to go to the audience and questions in just a second. So if you've got any burning questions, start preparing them now. Yes.
I was thinking about this and thinking about preparing for this talk of like what would I actually like to see on July 4th, and it got me thinking about what has made me hopeful in the last year, or what has felt like something that was new and exciting. And I think the thing that I came to was the images that were coming out of Minnesota in the winter. And
my husband would love you. He's from Minnesota.
the resilience and community organizing and rejection that people said, you're not taking my neighbors away, and I'll put my body on the line for that. And then, when people walked out of detention centers, there were masses of people there at the gate to welcome them back and get them a phone and put them in a car and get them food. And it was like this everyday kind of dedication to protecting one another and being there for one another. And I think that is what it's going to take.
Right. So democracy, pluralism, resilience, community. Heather, anything else you want to add to that list?
I mean, the optimistic part of me, I'd like to add to what was just said, and I would add not just Minneapolis, but I think watching Mamdani in New York, people have heard me say, I think that watching politicians actually on the ground making concrete changes for people in real time, it makes me hopeful. But at the risk of being the negative nut up here, I really also want to pick up on something that you just said earlier about the New Deal, which is I think this is also an extraordinarily important opportunity for us to really face the way that racism works in the United States. We are here in no small part, in every part, because of the backlash to the sharing of the New Deal, the actual opening up of the democracy, the demands placed on the democracy that are righteous and just. And if we can't use this 250th as that opportunity to really look at that and own it and call it out without being called divisive ourselves, I think we're in trouble.
So accountability in a way.
Because that is the core of why we are unable to be fully unified on, for example, economic issues that the majority of people would benefit from. And we have to call that out without being sort of sidelined and said, well, that just makes you divisive in this moment.
Right, so democracy, pluralism, resilience, community, I'd say maybe accountability or transparency, to which I'd also add, by the way, the word service, because we do have Jared on the platform, but I think service is another key, trait of the American vision.
Can I add
Also later.
skepticism?
What?
Skepticism.
I missed out what you said. Skepticism? Yeah.
I wanted to make that point. I know you got to wrap this up.
No,
but
I don't. I was actually asking a
on the
question.
drive from Heathrow to Cambridge, I got the driver finally figured out what I do, and it turned into an hour-long discussion about politics. And I was struck that what he was saying to me sounded like any number of my constituents would have the same conversation with me, or I could go anywhere in America and have the same conversation. And basically what he said was, I feel scared that we, the people, have lost control. To what? And he's basically talking about big multinational corporations. He's talking about big government, corrupt leaders. We're having the same debate on the other side of the Atlantic, and we have for a long time. And Heather referred to this, and I missed the opportunity, but I want to add skepticism, because I think this fear of power in anyone's hands and the consolidation of power, coupled with this belief that we can do it ourselves, is got to be a part of what we're celebrating and holding on to as we look ahead to the future.
So skepticism and a sense of agency, a sense that we can take our destiny into our hands and build a country, which of course is what inspired the original writers of the Declaration. And in many ways, what everyone needs to rediscover right now. But anyway, you now have agency as an audience, and you can answer questions. So anyone want to ask any questions? We have a question right in the back row. And it would be courteous but not compulsory to say your name, and please keep it short. Only because we don't have that much time.
Hello? Oh, that's loud. Hi there, thank you so much for the discussion. I really enjoyed it. My name is Shivam, I'm from the California Bay Area. I'd like to ask about the panel about a concept that I think is pretty closely tied to the Declaration, which is American exceptionalism.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder what you guys think about the concept in a time when America is facing a lot of internal and external challenges and pressures.
Right.
If it's something that we should still talk about at all, or what it means to you guys today. Thank you.
So, Jared, do we still believe in American exceptionalism?
The last time I was in England, I was at the London Defense Conference, and people were asking me how we in America felt about being the leader of the world. I was interviewed yesterday. I think the two people are in the room. They're asking, is the rest of the century going to continue to be an American century? I think most Americans reject the premise. It's not how we think of ourselves. So, at risk of getting yelled at, I'm going to reject the premise. I think America is great and Americans are great. And the idea of American exceptionalism, that we are uniquely better than anyone else, is wrong-headed and not the way that most of us think about ourselves back home.
Would either of the historians like to weigh in before I ask Jamel?
I mean, I think we are exceptional in some ways, and they're not very good ways. We have more people locked up in prison than any other country on the planet. We could laundry list all the ways in which we are exceptional in very unflattering ways. Unfortunately, we are not exceptional in this struggle that we are having. If you just look around the globe, the rejection of pluralism, the rejection of immigration, the rejection of the public in favor of the private. I mean, this is a global struggle right now. And so, I mean, it's not really it's both.
Right. Caroline?
Yeah, a lot of American historians focus on how Americans in the past have exceptionalized themselves and the nation, and I think that generally they roundly reject that America is exceptional, and I would agree with that. I don't think it is exceptional. And I think that recognizing that it's not is actually helpful in this moment, because there are so many other examples of nations that have autocratized, and we can learn from those nations that have clawed back democracy in some way.
Absolutely.
About what to do.
Jamel, do you think this exceptionalism tag or meme is useful or more destructive?
Yeah, I think it can be actually quite politically useful. I mean, you always got to separate this. Like, if you're doing kind of hard historical analysis, you're like, well, no, the United States is an exceptional country, and there are ways, as Caroline notes, that in rejecting exceptionalism in that sense, it can actually better help you understand what's going on, right? Sort of, it can put us in conversation with our neighbors in Latin America, for example, with whom we have this shared history, right? We are these New World nations dealing with a lot of the same challenges in terms of our relationship to our indigenous populations, our relationship with slavery, all these things can help us see this more clearly. But the instrumental way in which exceptionalism can be, I think, politically useful is that I think if you hold out this sort of exceptionalism as kind of like we're the world's oldest democracy, we're this melting pot, et cetera, I think that can be a useful ground from which you can push back against sort of the illiberal urge. Recognizing, again, you're being very instrumental here. You're not telling a true story necessarily. You're telling a story. But when I think about, the figures in the administration like J.D. Vance, who are constantly inveighing against sort of creedal nationalism, if I'm responding to that in a political way, it's like, well, what do you want what do you want the U.S. to be? You want it to be hungry? Like, is that what you want? No offense to any Hungarians. Actually, shout out to Hungarians right now. But you know what I mean? Sort of being able to hold out the U.S. is sort of exceptional in some sense, I think, is a useful way of pushing back against, I would describe political movement that very much wants to lower the horizons of what the United States can be. So
Right.
Yeah.
So, any more questions? Got a question over there at the front. Okay, well, why don't we take two? We've got a woman.
Right here.
Back. All right, okay. Okay, right, sorry. Over there, and then why don't we collect three, and then you can talk to answer. One over there, one back there, and then if we have time, over to you. Yeah.
I'm a 19-year-old American right from the center of the country, Ozark County, Missouri. As a member of Gen Z, I've watched our country go through what feels like a very, very dark time. But I hope I speak for many Americans, especially young Americans. I refuse to give up on this country. So I asked the panel, what can you share with us to give us hope that we will have a brighter future and we will continue to uphold the values of the Declaration that built this country?
Okay, so while you're thinking about that, let's take the two other questions, one back there and then one over there, and I'll then pass. Okay.
Hi, thank you guys so much. My name is Jung Yoon. I'm from Syracuse, New York. My research is on understanding Trump's charismatic appeal. And so I've been speaking with Trump voters and also people who don't support him. The picture is so black and white. And so when you guys say things about trying to build conversations across the political spectrum, like, I kind of just want to see if we can interrogate that a little bit more of like, what are the real concrete ways to have that kind of shared understanding, because it's so black and white.
Okay, fantastic. We'll take the third question. By the way, I should say this is starting to feel a bit like a sort of collective therapy session.
Hi, thank you for this really interesting panel, and actually thank you for that question, because I'm going to pick up on that. I hear you talk a lot, particularly Gerard, about reaching across the aisle and the opportunities to do that, because while I really appreciate everybody's input here, I'm noticing that there's a lot of agreement in everything that you're saying. And I'd love to know what opportunities you do get to have these kinds of conversations with people who are perhaps not on the same side of the aisle.
Right, so what can you do to give the next generation hope? How do you actually have conversations given the black and white nature of the current discourse, and how do you reach across the aisle? Who would like to tackle those first? They're somewhat interconnected. Maybe Jamel, you're...
Sure. As far as hope goes, I mean, I get the hope question a lot, and I got to be honest, I don't really know how to answer that one. I think that to the extent, and I say that because sort of like, what does it even mean to have hope that things will be, will live up to these values? It's, either we will or we won't, and that's a choice that we make. And so I'd say like the hope comes from recognizing our ability to make choices, our agency, the fact that as people who are invested in this country, we can choose to live up to those values, and individually as a community, or we cannot. And beyond that, I'm not entirely sure what else there is to say. In terms of trying to reach out across the aisle, I mean, one luxury of being a political columnist is I have no obligation to do this whatsoever.
Do you talk to MAGA people?
I mean, I live in Central Virginia, and so I do. Virginia is a blue state, but it's and I live in a college town. But if I drive 20 minutes outside of town to like go to a farmer's market, and not like a bougie farmer's market, but like a shack on the side of the road farmer's market.
So it's not Whole Foods, but it's
if I'm talking to actual farmers, and yeah, I'm talking to people who voted for Trump. I have neighbors like down the street from me who voted for Trump, and so in my everyday non-political life, it's sort of I'm having, I guess, ordinary conversations with people who don't necessarily share my worldview. But in terms of the kind of like big picture, reach across the aisle kind of conversations, I'm not cynical about this, but I guess I question the sense that this is like a necessary thing. I'm not expressing myself clearly. There is not. It is an illusion. It is an illusion that Americans at some point in the past existed in this world where we all got around the table and hashed out our differences from across the partisan and ideological divides. That never happened. And so when it's like, well, how can we make it happen now? I don't know. It would be a first, right? It'd be like it'd be an exciting thing to see happen. And if you can figure it out, then like you patent that, you'll make some real money. You'll make some real cash.
Okay, so I'm going to bring in the historian, Sarah, and then come last for Jared. I mean, what do you think, Caroline?
Yeah, I think that reach across the aisle is something we hear a lot, and there's very few people who actually do have to physically reach across the aisle, and you're one of them. But outside of like actual politicians, I think that people don't fit into the party system the way that we imagine they do, right? We've kind of like transposed the lines of the Democratic and the Republican Party just like onto the American public. And that's just not how people think and not how people feel. Just like how independents aren't actually somewhere in between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and you just need to reach over enough either party and overlap, right? People have a whole map of ideas that do not align with this kind of reaching across the aisle metaphor. And so I think to answer the last two questions together, one of the ways to do it is actually to talk to people about the things that a lot of people really agree on, which is that people can't afford their housing and their groceries, and that a really small amount of people own a really enormous amount of money, and that is not good for people, for the vast majority of people.
Right.
So I think I think this is where bringing up Mamdani is really helpful, because after he was sworn in, he then went and spoke to Trump voters in New York City and talked to them about, like, how can I serve you as mayor, right? And so there's just a dedication to making life livable for everyone.
Heather.
Yeah, I mean, I think
we're getting towards the end, so
I'm
moving you along. Yes,
throwing all the questions together. I mean, I think that I actually think for younger people, there's historical reasons to have hope. I mean, you look at myriad moments in American history where, avoiding the across the aisle metaphor for a moment, where people stood together based on common interests and changed history, made this place a better place to live. And whether that was standing together to represent themselves as workers, or standing together for greater civil rights, or standing together for women's rights. I mean, there's all kinds of stories of ways in which mobilization works. Not perfectly, not without fractures internally, and not permanently, because one can never go to sleep on a victory, but that are hopeful. And it's hopeful that nothing ever stays the same. History is always in motion. By definition, the past will be the history. And so I think that's all very hopeful. And I've been on a book tour, and I actually have to say, the across the aisle part, I actually feel weirdly hopeful even there, because people will come to talks from very, very different political vantage points. But as Caroline says, the one thing that they can all agree upon is the very self-interested needs that people have right now. And they are struggling right now between the rage that they've been fed and the hatred politics that they have been, enculturated on, and basic human needs that might mean standing with people that look differently than them, that feel differently than them, think differently than them. And that's hopeful, I think.
Right. Jared?
Yeah, look, like bipartisan work in Congress is not like an extinct species. It's not a mythological creature that never was. It's real. It's happening every single day. We're really a reflection of the American people, for better or worse. And like we get what the people give us. Like the Congress is the result of the election. And it's pretty rare to see supermajorities. I've spent more time in legislative bodies from the State House to Congress in divided government. So most of the work that I have achieved and gotten done was the result of bipartisan work out of necessity. The only other option would be to say, let's just sit around and do nothing. The media doesn't cover it. They like to cover the conflict. And the conflict is real, not to make light of it. That's where a lot of like the big fight and debate is. But good things are happening across the aisle almost every single week that I'm in Washington. I don't see what people see about the president, but I represent a district that has voted for him. Look, I represent an Obama, Trump district. He won the last time by 10 points. I barely won. But in 20, he won it by 7.5. I won it by 6. That's a 13-point differential from the top of the ticket down to me. Like, I have no choice not only to work with Republicans in Congress, but to meet with and seek to represent as best I can all of my constituents. If I want to win, by the way, which I've done 4 times in some of the most brutal elections in the country. $48 million of advertisement spent in rural Maine in 2024, third most expensive House race in the country. I started thumbing my nose at the media a little bit when they try and label me, and I started calling myself a progressive conservative. And they go, you can't do that. Like, that doesn't mean anything. And if anyone is from Canada, you know that was once a party. But that came out from a union blue-collar worker who votes Republican, who in 2018 told my finance director, who was from Georgia, at a bar, oh, you work for that progressive conservative Marine. And he came running back to the campaign office and he said, we're going to win. Because we're running against an incumbent Republican. And, I challenge you, like, put me in any room, at any table with 20, 30 Americans of all different political stripes, and I will draw out where they have progressive principles and progressive policies that they support, and conservative ones as well. It's there within every single one of us, whether we like it or not. It's in there. And so I'm not really answering your question. Right. Like, I don't see what they see. And for you, go home when you are ready and, take this, in the best way possible. Like, one, never give up. Thank you for not losing faith. But just what we say in Congress, my friends anyways, the few that I've made in 8 years, when we're feeling despondent and down, is go home and touch grass and swim in the people in your community that are full of goodness and doing good work. And that's where it's at, and that's where you're going to find your hope.
Well, that's so true, isn't it? Well, I think that's a fantastic message for us all to take home on July the 4th, whether we are around a barbecue or not. Democracy, pluralism, resilience, community, service, accountability, agency, and skepticism. Those, in many ways, are core American values, which sort of ripple through so much of the Declaration. It is indeed a deeply unfinished revolution, in many ways less finished than it was then, but it's a revolution that should inspire us all to keep fighting, to uphold those principles. So thank you all very much indeed. Thank you to the organizers for both creating this day and also creating this center, which I hope is going to really act as a haven of rational, calm discussion about America, if you like, a place to keep the flame alive. And thank you to all of you for coming along today. And I'm now going to hand over to the organizers, who are going to give us some closing remarks before we go and have a drink, without a barbecue, but it's still a drink. Thank you.
Thank you. That was, again, a brilliant panel. And what I want to say is, whatever else the Declaration of Independence was or has been or is, we can't deny that it was an extraordinary leap of faith. It's not the only leap of faith. On a slightly smaller scale, I have to say this event was a leap. It started with an idea, then a conversation, then another and another, then more with colleagues from our network here, with colleagues from across the pond, and then the wider world, all jumping on board the idea that convening to ask and answer these questions about the United States in Cambridge today would be a good idea. So I want to thank everyone for their belief, from my co-conveners to the speakers, to the university, and everyone who came along, all of you. This day has been extraordinary. It's been a bigger and better day than I could even imagine. It's inspired us to take another leap of faith, which I think you've heard by now, is to use this day as a public launch of our campaign to turn the US network here at Cambridge into the permanently endowed Center for the United States of America at Cambridge. And so I want to thank Cambridge in America and Cambridge's Development and Alumni Relations Office for supporting this endeavor, as well as our early donors. So to learn more about that, to sign up to our mailing list for future events like this, and there will be future events like this, to see some write-ups of some of the fantastic scholarship being done here at Cambridge on the US, and to stay connected to us, please see the QR codes on the back of your program. Before we finish, the co-conveners, all of us, do want to thank one person in particular, Amy Colton, without whom this day would have not been possible. Thank you. Thank you, Amy. I think many of you, most of you, probably all of you have interacted with Amy and benefited from her meticulous planning and organization. So we couldn't have done this without you. Thank you so much. With that, I declare the event concluded. I invite you, as Jillian said, to join us for a drink. So we have drinks on this floor, on the floor above, but also it's a warm day outside on the terrace. And there we can have a celebratory drink, I should say a commemorative drink perhaps, together. And we can carry on the conversation. Thank you very much.